recording?
Yep.
Okay, call to order, flag salute. Pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Right. First, we have consent agenda, planning commission minutes dated March 10th.
The minutes, I'll make a motion, we accept as amended.
I'll second.
Okay. It's been seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Right.
I abstain.
Okay. So it is passed.
Russell, can you speak up a little louder, please?
Okay. Can you adjust me or? Okay, do we have any topics from the floor that aren't on tonight's agenda? Don't see anybody. All right, public hearing agenda is 7:01. Okay, this is a quasi-judicial land use hearing. The subject of this hearing is a request for subdivision, preliminary plat, and variance. Subject property is identified on the county assessor's map as lot 600 on map 4N1W-4AA. The applicant is LeGrand Townhomes. The owner is the same. Because the quasi-judicial proceedings require observance of certain procedural formalities, we'll take a few moments to cover some preliminary matters required for statements. Does any member of the commission wish to declare ex parte conflict of interest or bias in this matter?
No.
See none. Okay. Does anyone from the audience object to the ability of the commissioner to make a fair decision? Seeing none. Generally, in order to proceed, it would be as follows: required statements, staff report, applicant's presentation, those in favor, those neutral testimony, those opposed, rebuttal by the applicant, final questions, those of the record, deliberations, and decision. Following statements are required to be made at the commencements of the hearing pursuant to the City Code ORS 197.7635. The following is a list of the applicable substantive criteria for this decision as St. Helens Municipal Code 17.136.060 and 17.136.120. All testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed towards the applicable substantive criteria as described or other criteria in the plan, such as comprehensive plan or land use regulation, such as found in the development code, which person believes applies to the decision. Failure to raise an issue, including constitutional or other issues relating to the proposed conditions of approval in this hearing, in person or in writing, or failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the approval authority an opportunity to respond to the issue, precludes appeal to LUBA, Land Use Appeals Board of Appeals on that issue, and precludes any action for damages in certain court. All right, Jacob?
Now, just so everybody knows, because we have a mix of people here live and virtual, the applicant is here tonight physically. It's just the one applicant that wanted to be here. And then Associate Planner Dimshow will be the key staff presenter in this case.
Great, thanks, Jacob. Can you guys hear me okay in the council chambers?
Yes.
Okay, all right, and you can see my screen?
A little louder.
That last comment wasn't clear.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, your screen is shown on there.
Okay, great. If at any moment you can't hear me, just we can try to adjust the volume or I'll speak up. Okay, great. So getting started. So this property is somewhere you've probably driven by many times before. It was formerly a car wash most recently. It's property just along Columbia Boulevard, pictured here. The side street is North 6th Street along here. So what the applicant wants to do is replat 3 existing lots into 6 lots for attached single-family dwellings. He's also requesting a variance for front setbacks. And it's an interesting case where we actually have through lots. So there's 2 front setbacks on both sides. And we'll get into that much later in the staff report. So I want to point out this photo here just because we're going to come back to the frontage improvements along Columbia Boulevard. There's kind of 2 main issues that come up over and over throughout the staff report, and it's frontage along Columbia Boulevard and screening, planting, and buffering requirements. And those just come up throughout the staff report, and we'll come back at the end to discuss those in further detail, but I want to point out that they're going to kind of come up throughout this. And as we go through the staff report, there's text in red that kind of corresponds to the outstanding issues that we need to address at the end. So the lot is 3 lots, as I mentioned. It's actually split zoned. So the 2 lots abutting Columbia Boulevard, closest to Columbia, are mixed use, and then the lot furthest to the north is general residential. Fortunately for us, attached single-family dwellings are all treated as general residential, so R5. So the standards are the same in both zones. And this is a photo of the lot from North 6th Street. And you can see there's an existing driveway approach here. And I also wanted to point out the existing driveway approach here along Columbia Boulevard. Okay. So I'm going to scroll to the preliminary plat and just leave that up for a while. So the first standard we look at is minimum lot size. So the minimum lot size for attached single family dwellings is 2,500 square feet. And you can see here that the proposed lots range from 2,500 to 3,900 square feet. The minimum lot width for attached single family dwellings is 25 feet. So they range from 25, this one's a little wider at 35, and then the most northern one is at 39 in width. So those standards are met. We require street trees along any properties that abut frontage more than 100 feet. So we need street trees along both frontages. Along North 6th Street, that's simple because there's no frontage improvements there. So we can just require street trees as part of the design of those frontage improvements. Along Columbia Boulevard, it's a little trickier because we've got existing curb tight sidewalk. And so we'll kind of come back to that condition as we go further in the staff report. There's more discussion about frontage along Columbia. So these 2 streets are classified as minor arterials in our transportation systems plan. And that's really significant because minor arterials have higher traffic loads, and also we have greater access control standards. And so the spacing standard for frontage along minor arterials is actually 200 feet between driveways and existing intersections. And so because we have an intersection of Columbia Boulevard and North 6th Street, 2 minor arterials, the only real location for access for all of these lots was this mid-block crossing here. So that's why you see a proposed access easement for access along Columbia Boulevard. So these properties will actually be accessed along what would traditionally be the rear of these lots. Let's see. So a second access along North 6th here would be allowed because it meets the spacing standard between this driveway and the intersection along Columbia Boulevard down here. Also important for minor arterials is making sure that there's no backward maneuvering onto the streets. So for lots 1 through 4, as long as these properties have driveways that accommodate 2 parking spaces, that should be met because there's this nice wide access easement for them to maneuver. So in order for you to visualize that, a car would pull in and pull into their driveway here and have plenty of room to back out and head out face first onto Columbia. For lot 5, however, that gets a little bit trickier because you could have a home here. This would be kind of your building footprint. And so we want to make sure with the building permit that the driveway is adequate to accommodate backward motions, or to accommodate turning around, so that there is no backward motion onto Columbia Boulevard. And the same with lot 6. There's plenty of room likely, but we want to make sure with the building permit that the driveway is wide enough for that. So also significant for arterial streets, we have standards in our code that provide adequate protection for residential properties that abut those arterial streets. And that's to minimize the impacts of traffic and noise to anyone who lives along these lots. And so one of those standards is screen planting. So if you've got an arterial on both sides of your lot, the commission can consider additional screen planting to help buffer and protect that property from noise impacts, for example, of the traffic along North 6th Street or Columbia Boulevard. So there's a section in the staff report that talks about whether or not the commission thinks that screen planting or fencing may be warranted, particularly along this side of these lots. Traditionally, fencing isn't something that's required of a subdivision, but in this case, we have circumstances that might warrant a condition like that to protect the residences here. We'll discuss that later because it comes up again. Okay, so we're back to frontage along Columbia. So, like I said, North 6th Street lacks frontage improvements, so that will be a requirement. But along Columbia, since we have brand new existing sidewalk, typically the commission has allowed the applicant not to rebuild sidewalks if they're in good shape. However, I'm gonna scroll to this diagram here. As you may remember in that photo, there's an existing driveway approach located here. So I'll try to orient you here. So this is North 6th Street along here. Here's Columbia. Here's the existing sidewalk. And Jacob has labeled the existing approach. Trying to see the edges here. So it's right here. And so obviously this doesn't work with the proposed access easement. And so the question here is, if this area has to be reconstructed, given the existing approach not working, does the commission want to require reconstruction of the frontage along Columbia Boulevard? And if so, the reconstruction would be to a different standard than what's existing because of the corridor master plan and because there would normally be a landscape strip between the sidewalk and the curb. So that's a question that we'll discuss later. This is the excerpt from the corridor master plan that shows the subject property here, and typically the sidewalk, and then the landscape strip and the street. There's also a curb extension on the corner too. I feel like now's a good time to ask if there are questions. I can't really read the room because I don't know if you guys are deciphering this.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
The first question is, can you show on the bigger map, the aerial map, can you show where the fencing would be proposed?
Yeah, the preliminary plat, this map here.
No. The map that shows just, not only shows this lot, but also the adjoining lots. So the neighborhood.
Oh, sure. You want me to just pull up like an aerial?
Well, yes,
Okay.
I want to get oriented as far as where the proposed fencing would be.
Yeah, okay. I see. Are there other questions in the council chambers while I pull up this map?
Online, can you take one? No, I've got an echo here that's really bad. But anyway, I was asked by an old timer here if this had been a gas station at one time, and the lot next door had been a gas station, were the tanks taken out?
Yeah, and I was going to address that later in the staff report. I really was just trying to ask if there were questions about the frontage along Columbia and what was being asked of the commission to consider. There's
Okay.
still more I'd like to.
I have a question. Is this appropriate time for a question about the
Mhm.
frontage on Columbia?
Yes, yeah.
I just had two questions. One is the visual standards for along Columbia, because that is a corridor master plan. And it looks like that's the side of those buildings, not the front and not the back. That's part one. And part two is where Despains Hill comes down and the other streets come together. In the wintertime, there's a fair amount of students and a bus stop there. So I just want to make sure we're taking that visibility and those sight lines. Without standing on that corner, it's hard for me to see, but I make that corner at 6th Street every single day at 7:30. And there's a fair amount of students out there in the dark, rainy days in January and February. I just want to make sure that we're keeping those sight lines in order. And those are my only two concerns, was just access and visibility for pedestrians on Columbia.
Okay, and you're talking, just to be clear, you're talking about students walking along this sidewalk here and
I'm
crossing.
talking about, if you look at where Despains Hill, where it comes down, where there's that little flasher at the bottom,
Mhm.
the kids come out of those neighborhoods, congregate at that point, and then run like heck across the street.
Gotcha.
So, I mean, kids go where they go to get to school. And I mean, you have Lewis and Clark at the top of the hill. I just want to make sure that all of that access, because I realize this is a distance from there, but if you're pulling out on 6th and you've got all tall buildings there and you're trying to see, and there's kids on bicycles and scooters and whatever they travel to school on, I just want to make sure we're taking all that visibility into consideration. Yeah, you've just worked so hard on that corridor plan. I want to make sure we're taking all of our users into consideration.
Yeah, and something that the corridor plan tried to do is include curb extensions. So that's what these are, to reduce crossing distances. And if the planning commission decides to require the developer to rebuild that frontage, we would require that curb extension, which would help shorten that crossing distance between Columbia Boulevard. That's the intent of these anyway.
Okay, those are my only two concerns. Is I've just seen buildings push right up to the sidewalk,
Mhm.
and the side that is toward the sidewalk doesn't look like a front.
Sure, yeah.
Several places, and after the building's built, I'm getting hit by constituents in the community like, how did you let that happen?
Yeah, and vision clearance in this corner is important too. We want to make sure that the building's not placed in the vision clearance area here. But there is I just want to, hold on a second, Jenny, there is a 10-foot setback requirement here, so they will not be abutting the sidewalk or the landscape strip along here.
Right, but the one lot I'm speaking of in particular is not actually at a corner. It's that one on 4th Street, just in from St. Helens Street. I get hit up with that building a lot, with what that looks like facing, the historic street. There's historic properties on that street, and we allowed that to be built there. So I'm just asking that question that, I mean, obviously we can't make up rules, but if there's stuff in the code that says it has to be a certain way, I want to make sure it's addressed in the conditions. That's all.
Okay.
So Jenny, if you go back to that map that you pulled up before, that would be ideal. Keep going, down.
This one?
Yeah, that one exactly. So
Okay.
if you can show where you're proposing to put the fence.
Yeah, and this map is crooked. So this direction this way is north.
Okay,
So this is 6th Street. Here's
Right.
Columbia, and one of the requests of the commission is to consider whether or not screening makes sense along lots 1 through 5 along here.
all right. And do you discuss this later in your report?
Yeah, there's a couple other sections because they're requesting
Okay.
a
I'll wait for
variance for
that to come up.
setbacks. I mostly wanted to make sure that you understood the two options for Columbia Boulevard. And the two options are leave the frontage alone, which would require about 50% of the sidewalk that is existing to be reconstructed in order to meet their preliminary plat standards because of the access approach, the shared access down here. Or require complete reconstruction to the corridor master plan standards, since they're already having to reconstruct about 50% of the sidewalks that exist today.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone in the council chambers want to chime in on that?
I just want to expand on that issue a little bit.
Sure.
So, when we make decisions as staff, we have our code, we have case law, and then we have, in some cases, well, what kind of decision has the planning commission made? And so we've had several instances now since we've adopted the corridor plan where we've asked the planning commission, okay, we have these circumstances where there's an intact sidewalk, but it's the old standard. And do you feel that this new development proposal requires an upgrade to the new standards? And you've consistently said, if the sidewalks is sound, you won't require the replacement to the new standard. This one's a little different in that, given this shared access where the existing driveway approach is at, which is just south, east, had to get my bearings there, of where the mid-block crossing would be, based on the Columbia Boulevard being arterial street, you have spacing and mid-block is okay. So because of where those things are at, this is kind of a new question for the commission, in that, about half of that frontage is going to be impacted by this design. And so the new question is, okay, when up to 50%, more or less in this case, has to be replaced, does that warrant going into the new standard, or do you feel we should stay in the old? And that's going to be, this is one of those pivotal decisions, because we're going to kind of, use these over time. Well, this is how they felt. So now it's the 50% question.
Well, also, this was brought up by Al Peterson, I don't know, within a year, because that sidewalk was all replaced. And he was asking, why don't you bring it up to standards then if you're replacing the whole sidewalk?
Yeah. And I think that was a sewer replacement project, if I remember right, Jacob?
Yeah, I kind of remember that. It may have been some utility thing.
I just remember their funding stream was specific to the utility. And so that was the reason Public Works didn't upgrade to the new standard.
Okay, well, that's one question I had on that, but also
What's the difference between the old and the new as far as the sidewalk is concerned?
with a wider, I believe there's a planning strip.
How much wider?
Right here.
I don't think it's wider.
I think it's still a 6-foot sidewalk. The main difference is curb tight versus sidewalk, landscape strip, curb street.
So you've got,
So the ideal situation is that you have this landscape strip to protect you from traffic in the road.
and also you have a bump out there for your pedestrians. I
Yeah.
think it's a little, when you start asking small development of half of a block, and if you require that, it's piecemeal all the way. And I would say confuses traffic and pedestrians.
I wouldn't put that bump out in there.
Wouldn't put what?
was that, Andre?
The bump out I wouldn't put.
Then it's
Would be
not,
How many do we have of those in town?
Well, and let's try not to get too much in deliberations
Yeah.
now.
anyway, that's a.
I would leave that corner alone. The sidewalk all along.
I think the point is everybody understands what the decision is about the frontage along Columbia. If I understand, there's no other questions in the chambers.
Just leave it alone.
Okay, I'm gonna move on. So regarding utilities, there's a number of unique circumstances that this lot is dealing with. One is this old 20-foot wide sewer, I think it's and storm easement. So there's a utility easement that takes up quite a bit of lot 6. And we also discovered through, and you'll see this in the city referrals, there's a unknown size but operable sewer line that runs along here. And so there's some conditions in the findings, or not the findings, but there's some conditions regarding the developer determining the size of that and whether or not it's a main line or just a private line, so 4-inch or 6-inch. And then if it is a 6-inch line, considering an easement for that may also be warranted, because that means it's an extension of the public sewer line along here. We know there's obviously adequate sewer to serve all of these lots. There's water in the right of ways. So that's it on utilities. So there's some new language in our subdivision staff report related to a new House bill, 2306, that passed, and it relates to when building permits can be submitted to the city. So that House bill disallows a city from denying a building permit based on the conditions of a preliminary plat not being met if there's substantial completion of the remaining public improvements. So normally we would require complete public improvements to be in before accepting any building permits. And Jacob can chime in on this at any point. But basically there's some new language in the staff report and conditions relating to this new House bill that passed. And the end result is that there's kind of two options for a developer to go down relating to the final plat and building permit submission. And I'm not going to get into the details because this is something Jacob wrote, but there's more information in the staff report than probably the Planning Commission needs to know, quite frankly.
I can explain it in brief. Essentially, with subdivisions, we've said, okay, before we accept the final plat, it gets recorded, now you have your lots. We've been careful about bonds and stuff like that because the city has had some problems with those in the past, before my time. But some of that happened right after I got on board. So it was, I was well aware of it. And so usually with the subdivision, we want all of the improvements to be done, with some exceptions like portions of sidewalk that are just going to get torn up because someone's building on it, and that just gets finished with the home. And what this House bill says is we have to provide an option for bonding certain things. And so basically it allows some things to not be done to get your final plat in, to get some building permits into place, but then you can hold up the certificate of occupancy for those building permits for those improvements to be done. And I think, probably some big developer got in a fight with the city and they convinced the legislature to change it. But it's basic, there's an option if someone wants more bonds and stuff, if they're in a hurry to get building permits. And so you'll see some different language in the conditions than you've seen in previous subdivisions because of this House bill.
Jacob, this lot 6. Where's the entrance going to be?
That's a good question. And Jenny, if you want to tackle that.
Yeah, so thank you. So we're allowing a second access for lot 6 to be from 6th Street. So lot 6 will get access off of 6th.
The sewer easement,
You'll have to ask that again, Sheila, sorry.
will it go over the sewer easement?
Yeah, and it's pretty common to have, sorry, can you? It's pretty common to have flat work over utility easements. As long as the structure is not on the utility easement, we will have no problem maintaining that line.
If fencing was decided upon for down 6th Street,
So the
it
proposal,
include lot number 6 also?
no. The proposal would be, well, I mean, it's something the commission can consider, but staff was recommending for lots 1 through 5.
I think it's a through lot standard. And
Yeah.
number 6 is not a through lot.
Correct. So these are 1 through 5 are through lots because there's an access easement along the back side of them. And we treat that as a public or a private street. And the variance request is also, and we'll get into this later, but the variance request is also for only the through lots. So this 12-foot setback is the reduction. And so arguably the impacts are felt greatest for lots 1 through 5. Because that's one of the setbacks we're proposing to reduce.
1 through 5, why can't you access them from 6th Street?
So our spacing standard for minor arterials is 200 feet. And these lots don't accommodate a 200-foot spacing between driveways.
The core issue, Russ, is that both North 6th and Columbia Boulevard are minor arterial streets.
So
And so we have to be picky about the number of accesses. And as Jenny mentioned, backing and maneuvering into the street. And if you recall, the last subdivision Mr. Hatfield did was Hannah Place on the hill up to the middle school. And that was a collector and didn't really have any other options. And so if you recall, we had that particular easement design between lots to where cars could maneuver and back out. In this case, because it was on a corner and it was an arterial, 2 arterial streets, we had to think about it a little bit differently. You know, how do we achieve the access standards under this circumstance? And the code even talks about, you know, when you can't achieve the standards, you know, shared access is something to consider. Lot 6 is different because you have that huge easement in the front. And so for lot 6, that's going to give plenty of room for maneuvering and stuff because it kind of pushes that, the building footprint to the back. So it's basically, it's an access management issue.
And the fact that the developer is proposing attached single-family dwellings, you know, these are really narrow lots, and it's hard to get spacing standards between driveways when you have narrow lots and a high level of access control. I'm gonna move on unless there are objections in the council chambers.
we'll move on.
Okay. Let's see. So this proposal is not big enough to warrant a traffic impact analysis. We looked at that. We don't need any additional right-of-way. The right-of-ways are large enough in both streets. There's no common improvements proposed, but we will need a maintenance agreement for the access, the shared access for lots 1 through 5. So these lots meet all of the dimensional standards. Okay, so through lots. We've kind of already talked about this a little bit, but our code has special accommodations for what's called a through lot. And a through lot is one where there's access on both sides of the lots. So as we talked about, lots 1 through 5 are considered through lots. And our code says that a planting buffer of at least 10 feet wide is required abutting the arterial rights of way. And so you can see here, they're proposing a 12-foot setback along here. And so the commission could require a 10-foot planting buffer, which would only leave 2 feet of usable yard space for those homes. So the code does allow the planning director to make special accommodations. So the code says that we can approve alternative buffer standards given that it provides the same degree of buffering and screening. And so that's where that fence conversation comes up. Is it better for the owners of these homes to have a usable yard or to have a planted area to provide the buffer as our code requires? So that's kind of one decision that the commission needs to make. And I think staff is recommending an alternative standard rather than requiring 10 foot of planted screening and buffering. Maybe a fence is more appropriate to provide that same level of screening.
Will they have patio access out the back there from the units?
So we don't review actual, detailed building plans at the time of subdivision, but you could ask the applicant that during their testimony.
Yes.
Well, looking at that, lot 1, if it had a shorter or a smaller yard, might give better visibility onto Columbia. Does it make
Those questions until we get the applicant up there. Okay.
Okay. And then another standard is that all through lots provide a required front yard setback on each street. And so that's why this variance is being requested. So if we were complying strictly to the code, this would be a 20-foot setback from the easement along all of these lots. This would be 20 feet. And back here, this would also be 20 along all of these lots. That's strict compliance with the code. And then I think that leads nicely into our variance. There was one other question I think Audrey asked about it being a gas station. So there's kind of a long paragraph in the staff report that talks about some environmental testing that was done on this property. This property was formerly a gas station. They believe it was also a service station in the past. And the property next door was also a service station, a gas station. And both properties had underground storage tanks removed in the late 80s and early 90s. And we had letters from DEQ saying they complied with all of the state regulations for removal of those underground storage tanks at the time. However, some initial sampling showed that the removal of the tank on the neighboring property may have leached some contamination onto this lot. And the city had some grant funding available, and so we provided the previous property owner money to do some additional testing. And that testing found that as long as soil isn't disturbed at a 14-foot depth, there would be no threats to human health and the development of these lots for residential use. And it's not anticipated that digging to a 14-foot depth would occur for lateral digging, for example. And we know these properties aren't going to have wells and they're not going to have septic systems. So there's really not a risk for this development. And so that staff report just kind of addresses all of these issues. I would also add that the area of contamination is right where the proposed access easement is. And so paving this area kind of serves as a cap and would prevent any future owner, digging in their yard, which would have been their rear yard had it not been for this access easement.
So DEQ has no further action then?
Correct. Okay, so this leads nicely into our variance conversation. So because we wanted to make sure our access standards were met, and we worked with Dan to figure out a shared access here, that really limited his ability to have a building envelope that worked. And so we look at the criteria for granting a variance, and in the staff report, we kind of go through these and kind of talk about what my initial impression was. So the first criteria is that there's special circumstances that are peculiar to this development. And I would say a subdivision abutting 2 arterials is fairly unusual. And then added to that, wanting to develop attached single family dwellings make this kind of a special circumstance. The next standard is that the variance is necessary for the proper design or function of the subdivision. And obviously, given the 24-foot access easement, you know, I think this variance is necessary to give these lots enough buildable area. So if we were to use strict compliance of the code, the building envelope would only be 36 foot in length. And given that there's only a 20-foot building envelope in width, that's a pretty small building footprint for each property. And so I think you could make the argument that granting this variance is necessary for the, you know, proper function of the subdivision. So obviously design and function also relate to adequate buffering and screening. So if we're proposing to reduce the setback along North 6th Street, I think it's really reasonable for the commission to talk about that screening and buffering requirement once again. So we've seen it throughout the staff report, but especially when it comes to granting the variance, I would argue the commission should really consider some type of screening along these lots. I think those are my thoughts on the variance criteria. I think it now would be a good time to talk about that screening, if there are questions.
Screening would be like a 6-foot fence.
Yeah, that's what's proposed in the conditions.
So is there a plant or shrubbery option that would be useful?
6 foot down 6th Street.
Yeah, so our code talks about what is adequate screening, and typically if we were complying with the strict compliance with the code would say screening with shrubbery of different varying heights, but we can make an exception to that if it doesn't make sense, given that it is a yard for these homes. Requiring screening may not make the most sense. Requiring a 10-foot buffer with all shrubs of varying heights, for example.
Correct me if I'm wrong, isn't that their front yard?
Yeah, they're technically both front yards, but we know that the access easements along here, so these are going to be driveways.
Right. But you don't normally see fences in front of front yards.
Right. I mean, this will be the landscaped area. This is
Right.
where they're going to have impervious surface along here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right.
So functionally, these serve as the rear yards, if you want to talk about it in those terms.
I would note that the normal fence standards for residential lots are 6 feet on the sides and the back and 4 feet in the front yard, which is normally 20 feet back. But the code says that along arterial streets, it can be up to 6 feet in height. And I think the idea is, 4 feet helps with neighborliness and to give that feel that people just aren't shutting themselves off from the neighborhood. But when you live along a busier street, there's just more stuff. And so the code allows more sanctity for your yard because of the increased traffic of the arterial. So it's, if you were considering fence compliance, a row of houses with a 6-foot fence in their front yard along an arterial street is something that is already allowed.
And because Ginny mentioned it, I wanted to point out the vision clearance area here would also be met with any fence that they were to build. We wouldn't allow fences to go to this very tip corner, for example.
Show me that.
Let's hear from the applicant.
Vision clearance?
I wasn't clear on what you said.
Oh, sorry, I'm gonna mute. So this area, it, you know, roughly is the vision clearance area where nothing higher than 3 feet can exist. So a fence of 6 feet in height certainly couldn't be built out to this very edge corner. We would make sure that the fence is not built in the vision clearance triangle here.
That was what I was asking.
Oh,
There.
I didn't know that. Sorry, Audrey.
At 12 foot, or it says 12 foot in red. I
Yeah,
was wondering if that could be the end of the fence.
Yeah, it wasn't included in the staff report, but Jacob worked out the vision clearance triangle. It actually goes to the edge of street. In this case, we would do the edge of sidewalk if it were built, and then go 35 feet out from a right angle, and that would be the triangle where no fence higher than 3 feet could exist.
Okay, that was my question.
I've got a question. You say a building envelope, not footprint. I'm confused. What's the difference?
Yeah, so if he wanted to come in and build a really small building, he totally could. This is just the very outer edges of what his building could take up. So we don't have specific plans at this point. That's not what we're approving.
Right. Would decks be on the outside of the building envelope space?
So if it's a structure over, I believe it's 36 inches, it can't go within this setback requirement. If it's just flat work, it could.
Okay.
30 inches.
30, thank you, Jacob.
So the building envelope just shows, you know, the area with the yard or setback requirements shown.
Right.
So if there's no other questions of staff, we can move on.
Okay. When we move on.
Okay.
Is that a cue for me?
Yes.
Oh. How subtle.
I thought you were staring at Dan. I'm like waiting for him to talk.
Okay, Dan, take over, will you? You're on.
Okay, number one is, you know, the setbacks and stuff is without knowing that I couldn't go on 6th Street to come out on.
Yeah.
I had drawn a set of plans and I brought them in and showed Jacob what I was going to do on them. But where he said you have to come out that one driveway there, that kind of eased what it is. And to cut that duplex down or row house down, not to cut it down, but where it's at now, I don't have enough in my dining area. That's why I needed that extra 4 foot for the variance, because to try to get around and get out the back door, you had to move the kitchen table. It just wasn't enough room. That's why I needed to get that extra 4 foot for the easement on there for the variance. But as far as the driveway coming out there, on lot number 5, I can always put the driveway on the south side where I can have room to back in and out of there. And, you know, the fence, I think the fence, you know, even though I could go 6 feet, I would be willing to go like 5 foot or something. If you go any less, people can jump over that fence. I just wouldn't want people being able to get into the back of the yard. So I would like to keep the fence at least 5 foot high.
Do you have a problem with 6 feet?
No, I don't have a problem with 6 feet. I'm just, I said 6 feet if you guys wanted to get more vision going around that corner. And that lot number 1, I still got a 10-foot setback before my 5-foot start. So I got a, so that is a 35-foot lot, not a 25-foot lot. So that fence would not be right on the corner. You do have vision around that.
So on your lot 1, 2, and 3, how many residences would you put there?
3, I want 3 bedrooms on them. But you have, the center one is a 25-foot wide house. The other is a 20-foot house on each side of it. On lot 4, that's a 20. Lot 5 is a 25. And lot 6, I got plenty of room to put the house there. But I had took this in to a designer and had them design something. Only thing they're gonna have to do is flip 4 and 5 and put the entry in the back instead of the front.
Are these going to be 1 or 2 stories high?
2 stories.
Okay, thank you.
Are these like the ones you did on 2nd Street?
Yep,
Same plan?
same plans. The only different plans will be is the center ones because they have to be 25 feet wide. But the 2 ends are the same as I put on the others.
Your fence, if you do a 5-foot fence along 6th Street, would you stair step it down for that corner so that you would have that triangle no higher than 3 feet?
Yeah, we would have to make sure it's either cut off or stepped down. Yeah, that's something we would make sure.
And, you guys have seen what I built in town here. I always go a little bit extra to make sure what I do looks good and stuff. So, is when I come down to Jacob and I ask Jacob, say, I want to buy this. What do you think I could put on here? We kind of go over it and stuff. So it's not that I just come and plop something on there. I always come and talk to him before I put in a set of plans. So,
Is Jenny Carlson on here? I don't see her.
Yeah, she is. Yep.
Comes there?
you where?
Jenny Carlson.
I'm here.
Okay. I was just gonna bring up that one building. What street were we talking about, Jake?
4th.
4th? About a house you said with, had no front to it, and you were questioning that.
I listed that as an example, but I'm just very cognizant, just the rules are the rules and I can't make up rules, but there's a historic church on the corner of 6th and Columbia. There's a beautiful home across the street from what you're developing here. And all of the homes down Columbia, all those people walk out their front door onto Columbia. So this is going to look very different from the streetscape. And so I know we don't have street standards. There's nothing I can do, but I just am hoping that we keep things in line with what the livability of our community. That's all. I just wanted to have that to be on the record. I want people to know that that was important to me because there's been citizens in our community. They're like, we put weeks and weeks into a corridor plan to make the neighborhoods nice, to improve our livability, to make it safe for families. I just want to make sure we're adhering to that. It's up to the planning commission to make the decision. And I'm just letting you know what I'm hearing about other development that are happening in all of our community, that people, the infill is happening everywhere. It's happening all over the state of Oregon. That's just a fact of life. Infill happens, but we got to make sure that we don't stomp on the neighbor's feet either. So
If you go down and look on 2nd Street and St. Helens Drive coming through there, it's very nice looking.
I just wanted to have that feedback.
we allowed to ask questions from the floor at all?
You'll have a chance.
Okay, any more to talk about, Dan?
No, the big deal is, I want to go with whatever you guys say I have to do on there. But if you look at it, it's going to improve the area. Is I'm not putting something out there that I'm going to be ashamed of. And is when I go in and we develop this, if they come up with a standard, and this is the height that you're going to have to put the fence and I didn't go along with 15th Street with putting all the concrete in there, but I understood backing out, not coming out on the street. So I understand this, to do that in the alley and come out that way where you're not coming out on the street. So I'm not unwilling to work with the deal, but we come up with that, and I thought that was a pretty good plan.
I have a question about the lot 1 next to the existing sidewalk. And my question is in the nature of landscape planning that could be along that area next to the sidewalk, not necessarily big stuff, not trees, but reasonable sized shrubs that are easy to maintain and visually attractive.
Yeah.
That's something that could work.
Yeah, very well.
There's a huge tree there
Catherine, I just want to add one thing because we didn't talk about it earlier, that the street trees along North 6th do act as a buffer in a way to the lots along here too. And that was talked about in the staff report a few times. And if you do require reconstruction of this sidewalk to have landscaping, well, either way, the street trees along Columbia, whether they're on private property or in a landscape strip in the street right of way, street trees do add separation or buffering from the street and traffic noise. So
great. I'm looking at a blank piece of paper that doesn't show me that there might be street trees there. So it occurred to me that it would be nice to have some kind of plant, and what the street trees would be just as great as a smaller, lower growing buffer.
Is, if you guys come up with trees or plants that you want in that 10-foot area, and I'm willing to do that.
Great. Okay, well, moving along here. Why don't we request testimony in support of the application? Anybody in the audience? Okay.
And then, so then we also want to make sure that any virtual person has an opportunity to. So those of you in virtual Zoom land, there's a feature to raise your hand. And I think everybody who's here is our other applicants. But I just want to make sure that there's that opportunity and that we're not ignoring the people in Zoom land. And then for testimony, there's in favor, neutral, and opposed. And Russell.
So now what? April.
So you're not in favor, you're
neutral.
Okay, so neutral.
I just have a question.
Okay, do it.
It just seems like 6th Street is such a traveled street that this would have been a great opportunity to backload the garages so that you're looking at fronts of houses on 6th Street that would eliminate any need for any fences. You'd be looking at people's beautiful front doors and front yards. Why is the city not? You understand what I'm saying? That they could drive into the back of their homes, but the front of their, it looks like a neighborhood instead of looking at backs of fences and backyards.
I think you're spot on there as far as.
Curious.
I think the reason that is the 200-foot buffer you have to have. You can't get driveways coming out.
You're talking about still driving in the back.
Yeah, still driving in the back, so you're backloading the garage. You don't even see a garage
Your
door.
front door is going to be facing 6th.
Facing 6th.
So you,
That back door be facing 6th.
well, no, she's saying turn your plan around so your front door.
That's why I originally had it, but I couldn't drive out that way.
You're still,
Well,
you're gonna put a garage in
So
your,
if your plan is in the back, it's called a backloaded garage where this is the back of the house, this is the front of the house. You drive into the back of your home so that it's more neighborly, that you're looking at front yards and front doors and no fences and beautiful landscape.
like Laurelhurst or.
Yeah, do an L shape as far as your drive and take it more space. Cut down on the drive, have it one way up from Columbia Boulevard and take some of the footage on lot 6 and just do the driveway out from there.
You can't do that because it goes into another people's property.
Lot 6 is yours, isn't it?
Lot 6 is going right down there. And the only spot I have to put a house on lot 6 is in the back because of the easement for the sewer.
Yeah, the other problem,
Put a driveway over that
But I
easement,
can't build a house over it.
but you've got 39 feet.
I can't, I can use it to drive on, but I can't use it to live in on.
Commissioner Semling, so you're talking about an access that goes in through 6th and then out through Columbia Boulevard or vice versa.
Vice versa.
Okay, yeah, and the problem with that is he's creating lots that are of such a size that the only possible allowed use are attached single-family dwellings. And so if we have an easement down the middle of lot 6 and 5, it forces lot 6 to have to be, well, it seems like it would force lot 6 to have to be a detached single-family dwelling, which wouldn't be allowed based on its diminutive lot size. So good thinking, but
That would have made it too easy.
yeah, there's a lot of technicalities in this for such a small subdivision.
You can respond to Jennifer's thought about the backloaded garage.
I have a thought about that.
Yeah, go.
And I don't know that it's going to be particularly satisfying to hear, but our subdivision layout here doesn't prohibit that at all. It's just a matter of architecture and design of these plans. And that's not something we can control. I like the suggestion for Dan to take into consideration, but it doesn't impact the subdivision design, the layout of the lots. I don't know if Jacob has anything to add, but.
Then we would not have a backyard at all if I put the front door in there. So you'd have to have some kind of dining room and stuff in the back to go there, and I don't have room for that with a garage there with only 20 feet to build a building. If you put a garage in there, I don't have no room for anything else. Well, I can get an entry going in there, but I can't get a dining area or something in there. The width of the building really determines what I can build.
Commission have any other questions? Dan?
Let me expand on that a little bit. So the fence requirement, and the reason that we as staff brought that up is because you have the through lots. You have, a street on each side, and our code considers private streets. So that's why we call that. And it says on a through lot, when one of those streets is an arterial, that you're supposed to have a buffer. And so the question for the commission, and usually the buffer is 10 feet of various plants and stuff like that. The question posed to the commission, given the variance and the circumstances, is do you, within your authority to allow an alternative buffer, do you say have a fence instead? And I guess you could conceivably say, well, 6th Street, lacking frontage improvements now, is going to require frontage improvements to our minor arterial standard. The minor arterial standard has a sidewalk and a landscape strip with street trees. You could say that, all right, well, we think the frontage improvement is going to provide enough buffer, we just won't require a fence. But that doesn't mean someone couldn't install one later on. The question is because you have the developer and then you have the home builder. Now in this case, LeGrand Townhomes is one of the same, but a lot of times it's not. And so does the developer put in that fence as part of the improvements for the whole thing, or do you leave that in the end? And the other problem, like Jenny said, is we don't have, our residential standards are pretty basic, you know, height, setbacks, you know, there's not glazing standards, number of windows and thing, you know, doors shall face the street, things like that. And, you know, we may get into that as we explore housing code down the road, and I'm sure you'll have fun participating in that. So that's a good conversation for later. But the one thing that we always have to think about is the goalpost rule. And that means, you know, we review proposals based on the standards that we have, not the ones that we wished we had. And so that's kind of where it all goes.
So why are we not requiring sidewalks on North 6th Street as a minor arterial?
We are. That's never been a conversation. That is absolutely a requirement.
Oh, but it's not on your diagram.
Oh, that diagram is to show existing sidewalks along Columbia. I assume you're talking about this.
So how much space do you have from where the building is to where the end of the street is? Do you know that distance?
Are you talking about this distance?
I'm talking about the 12 feet, is that from the end of the building to the end of the street, or to the curb?
Okay, I see your question. So it's two answers. This is just the building envelope, so we don't know that his footprint will go to the edge of this. So that's the first answer. The second is yes, there's a lot of undeveloped right-of-way here to the street. I don't know if I have the measurement exactly. I could probably find it pretty quickly. I think there's something in the file. But is that going to another question?
Well, it doesn't show on here in regards to the sidewalks on any kind of improvements on North 6th Street. And it kind of begs on the issue of how you're fencing this and what improvements for North 6th Street you're going to be demanding or that are already there.
So for North 6th Street, there's no frontage, and the requirement as written in the staff report now is frontage improvements to the city's minor arterial standards. So that would be a landscape strip with street trees and sidewalks.
All right.
And the fence requirement is something that you can decide to include or not.
So so when you say 12 feet between the building and the end of this lot, that 12 feet does not take into consideration any sidewalk or any of the other required improvements.
Correct. Yeah, this is just the edge of the property. The right of way extends beyond that, which is where the sidewalks and landscape strip would go.
All right. And I have another question.
So, hey, great. Can I expand on that one question just a little bit more to help you understand?
Yeah, please do.
So to give you an understanding of scale, so what that shows, and that's the variance request, is to have a 12-foot yard along 6th Street. So that yard is measured from the property line. You're going to have a 6-foot sidewalk, a 5-foot landscape strip for street trees, and then a 6-inch curb. Okay. And so you're already 10 feet before the travel lane. Now, in the case of 6th Street, we have one of our classic extra wide rights of way. It's an 80-foot wide right of way.
True.
And any new subdivision that we have, there's usually, 2 to 3 feet between the property line and the back edge of the sidewalk. It's very possible because the right-of-way is extra wide, our normal standard for a minor arterial street is 60 feet in width. In this case, we have 80. And so chances are that there's going to be even more width between the actual property line and the closest travel lane because of that no man's land.
Right. Okay. Good point. The other question I had is the spacing between lot 3 and lot 4. Can you explain what that spacing is?
Yeah, that's a good question because it relates to one of the conditions. So we know these lots can't be used for anything other than attached single-family dwellings. And that's another reason we wrote not footprint. It may be Dan's intention to build 2 buildings at 3 dwellings each, but he very well could decide that he wants to do 2 buildings at 2 dwellings each. This is just representing an average side setback between lots. So the side setback between attached single-family dwellings is 5.
Okay, so you're saying that the minimum would be 2 attached dwellings. So that would give you spacing. So there would be 2 dwellings, a potential space, 2 more dwellings, and then a potential space, and the final 2.
Yes, and
Okay.
this maximizes his building footprint because if you have 3 sets of 2, then you're going to have additional side setbacks between those.
But that does that take into account enough side yard spacing setback for the side yards if they're divided by 2 rather than 3?
Well, he's not requesting a side setback variance. So if he comes in with plans showing 3 buildings at 2 each, we would ensure that the setback requirements are met.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure this is the route he wants to go since it sounds like he's already designed them as such. So
Thanks.
And just to add a little bit to that, our code says 2 to 5, not 6. And I don't know why they chose that. That was before Jenny and my time here. But so you can have clusters of row housing in groups of 2 to 5. So if you have a 6-lot subdivision, really the only options are 3 buildings, 2 units each, or 2 buildings, 3 each.
Okay.
do we want to move on to additional testimony?
Sure.
That's you, Russ.
Opposition is where we're at. You want me to help, Russ?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there anybody, there's nobody else present, so there's nobody who's going to be in opposition physically here. If anybody else wants to speak in Zoom land, you want to raise your virtual hand. Otherwise, we'll assume that the any public testimony is concluded. No hands, so.
Okay. And the commission have any final questions?
So this is the point. This is the point where we can go through these condition by condition, or just highlight the areas that are red. And I think we've kind of talked about them to death. But at this point, it's a question about frontage along Columbia and what we want to do about this area for screening and buffering. So I'll do that.
So are we currently in deliberations or questions?
Yes, we are in deliberations.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Hearing no further questions of the commission, no further responses from the staff, the public record is closed. This matter is returned to the table for deliberations and roll decisions. All right. You want to start with Columbia Boulevard first?
Sure.
Comments?
The sidewalk, the portion of the sidewalk that runs to the east looks pretty new. Am I not correct?
It is new, yes.
Okay. So if we required the developer just to extend the present sidewalk, it would still, I mean, it would still be sufficient. It's not like it's broken up or in disrepair. I would hate to see it have to be replaced because it's in such good condition.
And when, just to clarify, when you say extend, you mean along North 6th?
No, I'm talking about Columbia Boulevard, your photograph here.
Yeah, so that sidewalk's already built the entire
Right.
length of the property.
Oh, okay. So we're talking, so what we were talking about was only North 6th Street?
The question is, since he's got to take out the existing driveway approach here in this diagram,
Right,
it's basically half of what's already built.
right.
So if he's reconstructing this and putting a new approach where the proposed access easement is, the question is, do we want to rebuild the remainder to the correct standard, or have him rebuild this segment to the standard that's already there?
Well, that's what I'm saying is that according to the photograph, which was taken in, according to the stamp in March of 2020, it looks in pretty good shape. That section running to the east, along where the fire hydrant is, it would be my recommendation just to have him extend that sidewalk where he has to make the replacement further toward the west along Columbia Boulevard.
2 corridor standards or just not to what's there?
Well, how much different are our standards as opposed to what is there now?
Well, you'd have curbs.
It's a big difference. Right now, it's sidewalk, curb, street. The corridor plan standard is sidewalk, landscape strip, curb, street. And so it's the main difference is the landscape strip.
I've got a question on that. Is the existing sidewalk at the same location of the corridor, proposed corridor?
Not too far off. Because when we did the corridor plan, it maximized the use of those extra wide rights of way.
So it could match right up and never be torn out because it could be used as a sidewalk still, and then you'd have your planting strip and your curb, no?
That's possible. Now, I don't personally build sidewalks, so I can't say that for sure. But it is possible, given where that sidewalk is, you know, right on the edge of the property line.
Yeah, and it shows, you know, in this small plan here, but
So
that
you
might
just
be.
extend it.
So. to the driveway. Match the old driveway or the new driveway.
New one. It's new. The whole deal, they did it last year.
Well, I mean, don't you, is there an approach right there?
Yeah, there's an approach there already. I don't know what he's talking about there, making a new one.
The approach is, if you look at this exhibit, so at the very top of that, that's the access easement in red. And the throat of the driveway starts more or less at the edge of that easement. And so the driveway is not centered at all where that easement would be. That's the problem.
Why would you just not go with what's there? I moved the the driveway. You guys put a new sidewalk in there. If you was gonna do it, why wouldn't you did that at the same time?
And I remember when I first started here and seeing those driveway approaches put in, I'm like, God help me, we're gonna have to deal with this someday. They shouldn't have been put in there, but they were, and here we are dealing with it.
So basically, what we're looking at is having the sidewalk extended to the approach to the driveway, the private driveway. That's all that needs to be done, isn't it? As far as Columbia Boulevard is concerned.
Yeah, so the option that you're faced with on Columbia Boulevard is, do you just keep the curb tight sidewalk and just move the driveway approach up and stay with that? In that case, street trees would be on the private property side. 6th Street, there's no frontage improvements, so you're gonna have the minor arterial standard with the landscape strip. So that, that one's easy. On 6th Street, do you go with the curb tight now, or because about half of it needs to be replaced, which is a different question than you faced before. So half of the existing curb tight sidewalk will be intact, half of it will need to be replaced to move that driveway approach. And so the question for the commission is that because that much needs to be replaced, do you feel that that's enough to move you in to the new street standard, or do you go with the existing?
I don't know if I'm off on fantasy land or not, but when I look at this picture here, I wonder why it can't keep going.
It will. Yeah, the sidewalk will be built along 6th Street.
And that will be in the same quality that we see in the photo now.
I sure hope so.
Better be.
I mean,
But if you went to the corridor plan, go to this map, all that would be changed right there. There'd be a big bulb out of concrete for the intersection. Last page.
Got it. Thank you.
So that's the corridor plan that's throughout the city. But you'd be requiring him to do just his frontage right there, a curb planting section of sidewalk, which
I think we should go with the existing and just continue it down to the driveway and do the driveway entrance and call it good. And that when you're ready to do all your other stuff, you can figure it out.
yeah, so I think the way you just, that's the case, do you let them do the existing and then let the city just do the new street section in some bigger project?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's an excessive burden on this particular project to expect that you would expand the requirement, especially when you have half of the a very nice sidewalk already in. I mean, I don't believe that you should the developer should be required to replace all this work.
How many years is it going to be before they get to doing this?
God only knows.
a huge grant or whatever.
I go for using the existing and expanding it.
Motion?
I make that motion.
I second it.
Okay,
Oh, just on that one condition?
yeah, we're just piecemealing this one, Jenny?
No, so it sounds like there's consensus there. So this condition will stay the same.
What was the proposal?
So the proposal is to use the existing sidewalk that's already built
Oh,
along Columbia Boulevard and to not require reconstruction of what's
well,
there.
we're not making a separate motion for that, right?
No, so let's go through these. It sounds like we've solved this. So this condition talks about modification of that existing driveway approach needing to be required prior to acceptance of a final plat. So this will stay the same.
Good.
So I'll move to the next red condition here. So screening. So the condition asks, does the commission want to require a 6-foot high fence along Columbia Boulevard as the buffering and screening requirement for through lots? And this would be along lot 1 through 5, noting that we will look at the vision clearance requirements. And I'll leave it to discussion here.
And you may want to think about, because one component of this is how you look at the variance. Because the variance is what's bringing that building closer to that property line. So if you're thinking, yes, we can be on board with this variance, then you know, okay, you have that 12-foot distance, and that may influence your decision on the fence versus the buffer, or that the buffer is simply going to be the street trees, and that's good enough.
Let me ask this question. If you require the fence, how much space does that take away from what would be their backyard?
The width of the fence.
So what are we talking about?
4 inches is
4 inches.
11.5-foot backyard.
You're talking about it, putting a 4x4 in there and putting a fence on it.
Yeah.
Just a reminder, the developer could build this fence regardless of whether or not we make it a condition. It would be an allowed fence as proposed.
But it just wouldn't be a requirement that we would set it out.
About a 2-foot fence with plantings.
What kind of fence?
Well, I guess my,
Let's go through.
I just can't-
Boulevard, it's-
driving down that street and just having a wall of cedar boards is just,
I buy that stuff from Home Depot where it's all put together at night. Cedar fence, right along there.
yeah, but
All put together, all I do is put a post each end of it, screw it together, and I'm done.
yeah. Well, I just, even right from here to Columbia Boulevard, you will find that situation with a fence right on
Yeah, you
a
go
lot where,
on St. Paul Street.
okay, but very few. It's mostly,
And it's cyclone fencing.
The only thing-
Put plants a little bit along on the inside.
Can the members of the commission speak up?
what?
speak up. Grace asked me to speak up.
I'm not saying much.
Whatever you say is important.
Oh, yeah. Well, Greg, what do you think about the fence?
Well, originally I thought it was a bad idea because I don't like fences on our major streets. But now with the understanding that that's the backyard, I guess a fence of some height is justified. I don't know about whether I would support a 6-foot fence, but I think that as long as we're talking about someone's backyard, I think that there should be at least some modicum of privacy. So at least a privacy fence. But like I said, I'm not sure that I'm not sure how I feel about a full 6-foot high fence.
3-foot cyclone with plantings right behind it. So the dog couldn't get out, but you'd be a very soft fence along that street.
you would have no privacy for the people.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
what about a reasonable height fence, 4 feet, 5 feet, something like that, with uprights?
Arborvitae? What you're trying to think of?
No, part of
Oh,
the fence.
slats.
Slats on the fence. And
No,
you could plant shrubbery on the house side of the fence if they want more privacy.
Variable space.
I don't know.
Plant whatever you want on the inside.
Okay, where are we with this? We're not getting anywhere with this fence thing. Audrey, what do you sleep?
no, I'm just shaking my head listening to talk of a fence. But the developer said he would consider a 5-foot fence. And I don't like the idea of a cyclone. I'd rather see a solid wood than a cyclone.
Exactly.
Looks better.
Cyclone always ends up looking like a cyclone, even if you put slats in it.
Well, and it also wouldn't meet our screening requirements because it's not site obscuring.
Well, let's go with the proposal that it'll be a 5-foot fence.
And he was okay with that too, the developer was. So let's just go with that.
So, you like a 5-foot fence? Greg, you like a 5-foot fence?
Yeah, I would say 5-foot fence.
Solid?
Or across Columbia.
Remember, this is the alternative to this buffering and screening requirements. So
Well, I only say solid because it gives privacy to the owner.
So we would be considering landscaping versus a fence, you're saying?
yeah, so let's just revisit this so you understand it. And I know a lot of these rules are weird and abstract. So we have the through lots. One of the streets, 6th Street, is a minor arterial street. So the code says, all right, subdivisions, residential lots along through lots, the side with an arterial street, you're supposed to have the buffer. The standard buffer is a 10-foot swath with a bunch of plants in it of various heights. The code says that the approval authority may approve an alternative to that standard if it affords the same buffering under the circumstances. And so you're the approval authority. And so that's why we're throwing this issue out to you. One of the aspects of this development that feeds into that is the variance. If you had 20 feet, the standard yard requirement, you'd have more room. The variance request reduces that to 12. And so if you had a 10-foot buffer, you walk out in your patio and you get a bunch of pine needles in your mouth because the plants are right up against the house, right? So not a lot of room. The code talks about the arterial and needing something there. And so given the less room that you have, what staff has presented, well, you can consider a fence. And the advantage of having the developer put in the fence, at least you get something uniform in that case. And you do have, because you're accepting an alternative, and so if you're talking about a fence, you have some latitude on the type of fence. Now, naturally, it would be site obscuring if you're considering the buffer, but you could say, exactly, yeah, good neighbor or not cyclone.
Cyclones. Not appealing.
I did put some up on 2nd Street. They're really nice. I just built me a brand new house and I have to do the same fence around my house.
Or you could say, well, we believe that when the developer installs the street improvements along 6, which include the sidewalk, the street trees, that will afford adequate buffering from your perspective, and no additional requirements will be required of the developer. So conceivably, you could say, well, we don't need anything new. Or you could say, well, we want a fence, or well, we just want the dam buffer. So you kind of have those options.
I have a question about fence. I've got no problem with whether it's a wood fence, whether it's a cyclone fence, what it is, as long as it's basically a fence, because it'll take up less room. as far as your boundary is concerned. However, what happens 10, 15 years down the road when said wood fence, no matter what it looks like, starts to rot? With our wonderful weather.
This is the way I do
It's going to be-
these fences. I put a 4x4 to the length of the panel. I put a 4x4, 4x4. I put 3 screws on each side, 3 screws on each side. 4 years down the road, you want to replace it, you take the screws out, put a new one on, you screw it back. All the same
I've
size.
had fences in my homes. And they're all well and fine. And however they're built, but wood in this climate rots.
That's why I
I'm
put.
sorry to say. Down the road, 10 years from now, he's not obligated to replace any fencing. What is going to make the owner of that property at that time replace or restore?
The deal is, ma'am, you have to do maintain.
And this is for us to discuss. So I appreciate
That's
it.
not for us. That's not our problem. It's uniformity for today.
I have a comment to make about fencing because I live in a townhouse community with a fence between the community and the street. The fence is made of aluminum and it's relatively light in terms of heft, but it provides a boundary so that strangers don't walk in. Plants behind it. As an aluminum fence are just white, it could be black or gray or whatever color you like, but it's been there 20 years and it still looks okay. So
Restore.
I was told to keep out of it. That's what I'm gonna do.
Well, we've got enough information.
it's just a suggestion and it could work for you or not.
Well, okay, we're gonna have the buffer of trees. How often are there trees on the 6th?
Let's see, Jenny, was there overhead power along 6th?
Yeah, they have really small straight trees.
Okay, so they have to be small and our code defines what small, medium, and large is. And the small ones are 1 every 20 feet.
Would we want to increase the trees down that street to maybe help that? And the fence and then, or
Well, they'll be public. I don't know if the city would want extra trees in the right of way necessarily.
more to water.
I was gonna say, when you get up by the ball field on 6th Street, you already have a fence, a sidewalk there. So how's that gonna work if you put trees along there when you do the new city codes?
Well, you'll have to have a transition. You're going to have places where you transition from older to newer cross sections, street cross sections. And that's just something you have to design for.
Okay, we're gonna want him to put a fence in, and how high?
I'll go for 5. But it has to drop down to 3 at that triangle.
Well, that's gonna meet code. That's really not, right?
We'll just add a provision that vision clearance counts.
And that wouldn't be hard to drop down, from 5 to 3.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
in order to try to move the process along, might I suggest that we go with the staff's recommendation of 6-foot high fence along 6th Street?
Okay, do we need to address Columbia Boulevard?
Fencing.
Yes.
No, because the fence is being brought up because of the through lots. If it wasn't for the through lots, we wouldn't have talked about it. And it addresses the side of the through lots, the front side, and there's 2 fronts that faces the arterial. So it technically doesn't count for for Columbia Boulevard. Though you do have the variance request, and you could find that the variance request justifies a fence along Columbia Boulevard.
No,
That's not something we've talked about.
I would be opposed to it along Columbia.
I'm thinking about myself buying one of his units and wanting to be able to let my dog go out. And it would probably go out to the back towards the street. And I would be worried about that or my grandchildren going out towards that street without some kind of fence or deterrent to keep them from getting off into trouble.
You would have the legal right as a property owner of that lot to construct your own fence around your property.
That helps.
By asking for a 5-foot fence, we're asking for uniformity all the way along.
Okay, so we have a 5-foot fence, the distance of lots 1 through 5. Site distance. Over here, Jacob.
Or you
About
consider
135 feet.
But then lot 1 would be with respect to site distance.
Yeah, well, we can make sure that's in there.
So the next call out in the conditions, if we're moving on, just is about street trees being required along Columbia Boulevard. We've already established that we're going to leave those sidewalks alone. So street trees are required prior to any of the developments of any of the building permits of those lots, and that would be in private property. So the variance, we've kind of touched on it. I assume if we're requiring the fence that we are approving the variance for the setbacks.
Yes.
Great. And then the last note there is about the variance as well. So I think we've covered all the red sections if there's a motion.
So what I think I hear you saying is, as recommended by staff, and then stick with the curb tight sidewalk along Columbia Boulevard, and then 5-foot side obscuring fence along 6th.
Yeah.
I think
You
that's
want a
what.
motion?
We want a motion on that?
That's up to you.
Yeah, we want a motion.
I think Audrey just made the motion. It was hard to hear.
I made it.
Okay, she did make that motion.
Second.
All right, seconded. All in favor of approving the variance for the sidewalk along Columbia Boulevard to stay, and 6-foot fence along 6th Street. What else am I missing, Jacob?
It's a variance and as recommended by staff, as the things we discussed, and it's a variance and preliminary plat subdivision.
Yeah, okay.
It's all there.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none? Got it.
And then a motion for signature.
City will plan will go back.
So moved.
Second.
Seconded it.
Motion for signature.
Oh, motion for signature. Seconded, and all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay.
And just so the people out there and to wonder what we just talked about, normally our code says that we can bring back a decision to the next planning commission meeting so they can review it. But usually we try to get the signature before that, otherwise it delays the decision by 30 days. Okay, Dan, you're done?
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. I ran into Mark the other day.
Oh, yeah, Pacific Mark, yeah.
Yeah.
He's doing Lincoln High School there.
He's doing pretty good for himself.
Well, yeah, if you were given jobs,
City gave it to him.
you bet they did. I'm looking for minorities.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Thank you.
let's keep the show going
Yes,
here.
sir. Yes, sir. All right. It's now very late. 8:45. A public hearing is now open. Quasi-Judicial land use hearing. Subject to this hearing is request for conditional use permit and variance. Subject property is identified in County Assessor's Map lots 704 and 2002 on map 4N1W-5ZB. The applicant is multi-engineering. Owner is St. Helens Land Company LLC. Because the quasi-judicial proceedings require observance of certain procedural formalities, we'll take a few moments to cover some preliminary matters required from required statements. Does any member of the commission wish to decide ex parte contact or conflict of interest advice in the matter? Anybody out there in Zoom land? There's none. Okay, does anyone from the audience object to the ability of a commissioner to make a fair decision? Seeing none. Generally, in order of proceedings will be as follows. Required statements, staff report, applicant's presentation, those in favor of the application, neutral testimony, those opposed, rebuttal by the applicant, final questions, close of the record, deliberations and decision. The following statements are required to be made at the commencement of the hearing pursuant to the city code ORS 197.7635. The following list is applicable substantive criteria for this decision. St. Helens Municipal Code 17.100.040 1AF. 2F, that would be 2F, yes. And St. Helens Municipal Code 17.108.050 1A through E. Testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed towards applicable substantive criteria as described or other criteria in the plan, such as a comprehensive plan, land use regulations, such as that is found in the development code, which the person believes applies to the decision. Failure to raise an issue, including constitutional or other issues relating to the proposed conditions of approval in this hearing in person or in writing, or failure to raise an issue accompanied by the statements or evidence sufficient to afford the approving authority an opportunity to respond to the issue, precludes appeal to LUBA, Land Use Board of Appeals, on that issue and precludes an action for damages to circuit court. All right, who's giving this?
This is me.
That's you. Okay, Jake.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that. I'm sure everybody enjoyed the reading of the statements. That's the most
That's a high
tantalizing
point for
part
me.
of these hearings. So this is a major modification, conditional use permit, and a variance. And the reason it's a modification is we are building off a previous conditional use permit that the Planning Commission approved in 2018. And so we're at the old Violet's Villa manufactured home park site. If you recall, in the summer of 2018, we had a conditional use permit for an apartment complex. And what I have on the screen for you here is the approved site plan for that complex. And just to help orientate you, this is US 30 here. Here's Matson Street. This is McBride along the north side. The Village Inn is right here. This is Braden Street. This is the new street in town that's been developed. And then this is the apartment complex currently under construction. You've seen the subdivision, you've seen some zone changes, including a zone change to this property down here. This is the main feature of this particular development. But there's a little bit going on here as well. So I just wanted you to have your bearings with that plan. If we look at the site plan for this proposal, we'll see a little bit more of what's going on. So it's a major modification because we're adding a storage facility here on this property south of Braden. And then on the main site, there is a large flagpole that's big enough it requires a permit per our sign code that wasn't in the original plans. And then there's another bike shelter that wasn't on the original plans. And since those came up around the same time as the storage facility, we figured, well, let's get it all taken care of in one, so we get everything approved. But the main catalyst is the storage facility. And so, like I said, it's a modification of the conditional use permit. It's also a variance. And the variance is to allow an accessory structure larger than normally allowed. In fact, that should sound familiar because we had one of those on Gable Road last time, or 2 times ago, I can't remember, but recently. And the normal maximum size for an accessory structure is 600 square feet, and the storage building is larger. So that's the overview. So I'm not going to cover every condition, but the things that I think the Planning Commission kind of needs to chew on, and just like in the previous report that Associate Planner Dimsho did, that stuff is in red in the report. But one of the things that we have to think about, so this property is zoned commercial, and in our commercial zoning, we don't allow storage facilities. That's an industrial use. Of course, this is meant to serve the residents of the apartment, so it's an accessory use. But in this case, we have this property that's across the street, so it's a separate property. And usually when we have a piece of property, we don't allow an accessory use before we have our principal use. And in this case, the primary or principal use are the apartments. So that's one thing. And then 2, storage isn't allowed. And we would want to make sure that this lot that's proposed to have the storage facility is not sold separately from the rest, and then someone just turns it to a storage facility unto itself, because that's not really the intent. And so there's 2 methods of dealing with this. One method is a covenant on the property that says this property and this property is supposed to be tied together in perpetuity until the city releases it. And in dialogue with other planners, some planners don't like deed restrictions because they feel that they could be broken easier. So the other method of tying these properties together would be to go through a land partition, and it would be a 1 parcel land partition that would take the main lot on the north side of Braden Street and this lot on the south side and make it 1 property. So those are the 2 options. The latter is considered a stronger bond, but we have done the deed restriction, many examples, and so far that hasn't caused a problem for us. So there's that zoning and use question. Another question, we go back to fences, but I think this is going to be a lot easier, the fence question. So as I mentioned in the last public hearing, the front yard of the fence is only supposed to be 4 feet in height, unless you're along an arterial, and we're not along any arterials here. And in this case, you know, this property is a corner lot, and so the front is actually the narrowest frontage along Braden Street here. The approval authority, you can allow a fence of a greater height if you believe it'll mitigate against a potential adverse effect. And staff totally supports allowing this portion of the fence to be 6 feet, especially because of the way the right-of-way and stuff works. You're going to have a lot of extra space between the property line and the actual edge of the road. And so it's going to give the feeling of a setback anyway. So we don't see any problem with that, but that's something you have to bless. A condition that we have on here that we just want to talk to you about has to do with walkways. you'll see this little mid-block crossing. Now this is actually already in place. In fact, if you go out there to see it today, you'll see a couple of bronze elk statues. I think they're made of bronze. They at least look like it. The idea is to have a mid-block crossing so folks over here can easily get to the storage facility. And the one thing on this plan that's not there is a walkway from here to wherever the man gate or the equivalent would be. And so we have a condition in there to cover that. The variance. Now, if you recall, and I can pull up the floor plans for the buildings themselves, but we've seen a lot of accessory structures, and this building shares more features with the apartment buildings than most of the accessory structures that we've seen. Because of that, because the site's so large, staff doesn't see any problem granting this variance. It really makes sense. And so if you want to get into the variance criteria, we certainly can. But staff does recommend approval of that. So one, you approve the variance or not. Second big question is, how do you want to tie those properties together, by deed or partition? And then are you cool with that fence being 6 feet high on the north side? There's a lot of other conditions in there. The applicant will have an opportunity to talk about it, see if they have any concerns. But those are the things that I wanted to highlight with the commission. So any questions for me before we open it up for testimony?
I have a couple. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I have a couple. Jake, can you tell us the proposed storage building has a height of 27 feet, excuse me, 27 feet 8 inches. What is the height of the nearest building?
Well, they're all the apartment buildings are 3 stories in height.
Okay.
And I could find the plans, but I think they're all pushing 35 feet or pretty close.
That's fine. That's what I needed. The other question is does the staff have a recommendation regarding either deed restriction or the plat?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I think we could live with both, but the plat option, I'll sleep better at night.
We want you to sleep.
Because it's a stronger bond.
Sure. So the next question regarding security. Is that something we have to consider in any of this deliberation? Security for the building?
Sure, yeah. I mean, crime prevention is a component in the development code, and not something I got into too much, but they do provide proposed fencing around all sides. They have a good lighting plan in there, and that's why I didn't make it all that big of a deal. I think security does seem adequate.
Okay. So you're comfortable with the lighting?
Yeah, as given the concept that they proposed in there, yes.
All right. Then there's a talk in the plan or the proposal for a flagpole. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, and I didn't get into that too much. So, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So if we go back to the site plan, there's this access over here off of Braden. Let me go to the larger one. So
By the swimming pool.
yeah, so this building, this is the one building that's different in that it's not 3 stories, and that it's not even apartments. This is the recreation building, and right here you have a pool, and the flagpole is going by this building. So this is the area that we're talking about. These are the storage units we mentioned. And so if we go to the site plan for this one, it shows that flagpole right there. And what our code says is when we have flagpoles of a certain height, and it's in the, here it is. So if it's residential, it's 20 feet. If it's non-residential, it's 30 feet. And this thing is 45 feet. So either way, it's larger than both. Then we need a permit. And the one condition that we have for that is condition 11, that we have certification from an engineer registered in the state of Oregon that the base that they have will handle the pole and the flag, because obviously we don't want it to be a falling hazard. And our building official did not take jurisdiction over that because his limit is buildings, and he thought it was far enough from a building that it wouldn't be under his regime, but it still falls under the development code, and that's why we're addressing it here.
Can you once again give me the maximum height for commercial for flagpole?
Yeah, and there's not necessarily a maximum height per se, but what the code says is when you're above a certain height, that's when we're supposed to be able to take a look at it. So they propose a 45-foot high flagpole. And if this was a residential area, it requires a permit if it's more than 20 feet in height. And then non-residential, more than 30.
Okay, and one last question on the flagpole. Do you know what the height is of the flagpole that's along the riverfront behind the courthouse?
Oh, man.
Just estimate.
Really tall.
That's probably one of the biggest flagpoles I may have seen.
Okay. Is that beyond 45 feet?
I'm gonna guess. I've never really had to think about the height of that, to be honest. And honestly, I don't think I've really studied it for years. You kind of forget.
Put a garrison flag on
You
it.
kind of forget stuff is there because you work here so long.
Oh, it is
Sure,
taller
sure.
than the courthouse.
But it is taller than the courthouse, yeah. And that courthouse is not a small building.
No, it is not. Oh, okay.
Oh, that one, yeah.
I won't.
Okay.
So can we talk about one more thing? And that's the bike storage. Now, the bike storage is separate from the storage building, right?
Let me go to the original site plan. The bike storage is going to be right here. And so they proposed, if you can see my cursor.
Okay, yes.
So, we proposed, or they were supposed to have a certain amount of bicycle parking. And on this plan, they showed these being outside of a shelter. All the other ones were in a shelter. And then more recent conversations, they talked about putting a shelter over there, these, and it's like, well, that wasn't addressed in the original conditional use permit, so we should address it now. And I didn't really talk about it because, well, it meets all the standards. We just want to make sure we add it to the things that we're approving. So there's no controversy there. And in fact, it's good to have covered bike shelters. And that's kind of where the Planning Commission went with that conditional use permit in 2018 to favor shelters for the bicycle spaces.
Are there any requirements regarding security on the bike shelter?
Well, you have a lot of buildings surrounding it, and there's windows on all sides of the building, and the lighting and the eyes on the shelter and the fact that there are bike racks that you can lock the bikes on should provide adequate crime prevention.
But it is open.
Yes. Yeah. I can show you that. Yeah, there's the bike shelter right there. So it's kind of a gazebo of sorts.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Anyone else? On that lighting plan, C1-3 or .3. That shows streetlights. That's the radius of it. Is that what that?
Yeah, those are the luminary contours.
Yeah. Anything more would be as you enter right there. Is that would be on the building or something rather than?
Yeah, there is lighting proposed on the building. Let me try to find that. Okay, yeah, so if you look at the legend, so rectangle with an X, wall pack light mounted on building. And then we go to the building and you can see the light packs on those. And then, and actually these are the, it's like the luminaries for that.
Oh, I didn't see them. Okay, it's very light. Okay, yeah.
One question with the bike, public bike area, is that going to be illuminated at all?
Yes, there is. I can go back to the lighting plan that we have. For this and show you that. This is for the main one. Oh, there it is, photometrics. So these are the photometrics overall, and the orientation here is different, but you can see that's the area, and there's a variety of lighting out there. And in this case, you really need to get down to fine print. These little numbers are the degree of illuminance. Of course, that's only covering the parking area. But yeah, there's lighting on the building and throughout the site.
Any other questions? All right, we have the applicant's presentation.
Good evening, members of the planning. Mark, I'm with. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me all right there?
Yes, we can.
Good, thank you. So anyway, my name is Mark and I'm with Multi-Tech Engineering, and we're the project engineers and planners that have been working on this project since its inception in your community. And we've had a great experience working with all of your staff. This is it's a large project, and it's involved a myriad of different things as we move forward. And we're getting towards the end, and we're trying to wrap a few things up here. And so the covered bicycle area is one that the developer wanted to add to that area. And we just finished working on the design for that. And it's going to be a nice addition. It'll match the gazebo style in there. So it'll be a nice addition there. And they will have adequate lighting around that area to address your concern for security there. And then the flagpole, of course, that's Mr. Ivanoff just wanted to have a nice large flagpole that was very visible. And in the world we're in today, it's always nice to be able to display the American flag in a way that can be seen by everywhere. So he's trying to do that. And I'll be the engineer that's designing the pole base and making sure that it's adequate. So we'll be good there. So the Braden storage facility, I don't know how many of you were on the Planning Commission when we first brought this application to the city for the apartment site, but we did have storage on site, proposed on that site when we came before you with this. Because what Mr. Aronoff has found is that with each of the apartment projects that he does, there's always a need for the residents there to have a place to store things that are in when they're in transition from coming from a single family residence and moving into an apartment, or in that transition get ready to move out. My wife refers to it as stuff. I have lots of stuff in my garage, and I'm sure that everybody accumulates stuff. But he's found that to be a need, and so when the apartment project itself was approved, it was decided by the Planning Commission that we just didn't quite have enough space for all the things that we were trying to include, and that we needed some additional parking rather than the storage. So we took the storage facility out that we had proposed there. So as we were moving forward in the project, we had an opportunity to acquire this piece of property, and it became obvious that it was a good opportunity for us to add back the storage that project's going to need in order to accommodate the residents. We have a little over 200 units there, so we have an opportunity for a lot of good stuff to need a place to go. So that's what this building was set up to do. It's a 2-story structure. It has secured roll-up overhead doors on the lower level for larger storage areas, and then it has 2 entries that go upstairs to an upper level. Those doors are secured. You have to have an entry code in order to be able to get inside those to get up to the upper level, and then upstairs there'd be secured spaces created upstairs that are locked and secured as well. The building is a little bit shorter than what the apartment buildings across the street are. Staff was correct. We designed those buildings to be just right at or just a whisker under 35 feet. That's your height limitation for the apartment buildings in town. And we designed them to fit in that criteria. So it's a little bit shorter than those buildings there. We are proposing for security. Of course, it'll be gated. You'll have to have an access code in order to be able to get in, to get through the electrically operated gate. What we didn't show on the plan, but what staff has noted is the desire is to have a pedestrian path and a man gate, and we'll add that. And that man gate will also be set up on a code so that you can't get in without having a code. And that access way, we'll build that access way just on the east side of the driveway where that mid-block walk pedestrian, where we have that set to come across there and then come off that ramp, and we'll build that sidewalk right down southerly along the east side of the entryway there and put a man gate there, and then tie that with a walkway into the parking area so people can access from there right over to one of the main doors in there. So we'll take care of that. And then in addition to the additional security measures that we have out there is that there'll be security cameras mounted on this site that'll be tied back to the security system in the apartment that are part of the apartment security. So there'll be a way for someone to have surveillance security for this site as well as some of the facilities that we have on site in the apartment building. We understand the staff's proposal there to have either a deed restriction or to have the property partitioned to create a single entity. Not that it makes that much difference to us, but our preference would probably be to go the deed restriction simply because it's a little bit less cumbersome process for us to complete than a partitioning. I'm not sure that we probably should have asked staff when we read that in the staff report, but if it's the Planning Commission's decision that we do a partitioning, does this process tonight grant us the approval necessary for us to file a partitioning plat with the city for signature, or will we subject to another land use decision.
Land use decision, though it would be administrative without a public hearing.
Okay. So yes, we would just, if it's not that critical, we would prefer to go with the deed restriction just to avoid having to go through another process. But we understand the goal and we don't object to that because it was always our intent that this would be tied to the apartment building use itself. It never was intended that it would be something separate. So we understand that and intend to meet that criteria. So checking my notes here to make sure that I've talked about the things that I want to. We don't have any objection to the conditions, any of the conditions that the staff has proposed that are outlined at the end of the staff report. We've already made a lot of the improvements on Braden Street and had planned to make improvements along the frontage of this property as well. So most of the things that are being talked about in there are already part of our plan anyway. So with that, I'd be happy to answer questions that you might have of us about our proposals here tonight, the flagpole, the bike storage covered area, and the storage facility.
Well, we'll have that in a minute. Let's see if we have any testimony in support of that. We have one letter from Al Peterson. Does this need to be read in, or does it, commissioners have it?
The commissioners have it. We can certainly, yeah, we did receive a letter of support from a local citizen, Al Peterson. I honestly, Mark, I don't know if we ever sent that to you. We didn't get it.
I don't believe that was the packet stuff that we've gotten from you, but
It was received after the packets were sent out, but it was a letter of support. So
good.
I'm sure you would want to see a letter of opposition more so you could rebut.
Yeah, we're fine with support.
Okay. Any neutral testimony? You check Zoom.
Yes. So yeah, if anybody wants to speak on Zoom, raise your virtual hand.
I just had a comment.
Yeah.
Can I make a neutral comment? Is that okay, Jacob?
The counselor may participate in the discussion.
Okay, all right. I just want to make sure when I can make a comment. So let me know.
Yeah, now is okay. Yeah.
I just wanted to you made a comment about the landscaping over there, and that's been my walking route since the COVID. And I just really appreciate all of the landscaping. So I guess it's just so far so good. And I just wanted to put that in as far as just neutral. It just seems like things are going according to what he promised. And so I look forward to seeing the results of the rest of this process. Every time I go walk around the block every week, I work at a group home over there. And so I walk around that block all the time, and it's like I've just been really impressed with your workers and how nice they are to people that have to park over there, and they're super conscientious. And so I just think that's a good community partner to have building in St. Helens. So I just appreciate that work. That's the only comment I had. The bronze statues are amazing. So that's all I have.
Okay, where are we? Neutral testimony, opposition. Zoom on that.
No virtual hands being raised, so.
And we don't need a rebuttal then. So, do we have any final questions? Okay, seeing none. Okay, the hearing, no further questions. The commission and no further responses from the staff. The public record is closed. This matter is returned to the table for deliberations and oral decision. Okay. Well, I think we've answered pretty much everything. Let's see, first we're talking the partition?
So I guess the first thing the planning commission should make sure you're on the same page about is the variance. Because if you want to deny the variance, that changes some things in here. So that's probably the first thing you want to make sure you're all in sync with, and then we can go to the other questions of the conditions.
Any questions on the variance as proposed to us?
I think the variance is justified. I support the variance.
Voice to that. I think it's appropriate and logical. So I add my positive voice to that.
Yeah, I think they, we couldn't allow them to do that one in the original section, and so they took the initiative and actually purchased more property to make a good development work. So, yeah. Good.
Yeah, if we had more time, I'd tell you the saga of some of that I've heard, but we don't have time, so.
So good.
Save it for your memoirs.
Yeah. All right, so, well, we'll get the motion at the end.
In the end, okay.
But it sounds like everybody's, I don't see any frowny faces over the variance.
No.
Okay. So then the question is, tying the properties together. And so right now it's under what we would want to see happen before the building permit is issued, which is a little more aggressive than normal. A lot of times we'd want that done before occupancy, but just because of the different use, that's why we put it there. And then, how do you want to tie it? Do you want to do the covenant or the partition? Now, I've never been burned on a covenant, so I haven't had that experience.
Yeah.
But it's just kind of how you feel in this case.
I think because it's my recommendation that because of the separations of the properties, that we go with a partition. I think it makes it cleaner. And I don't think that there's any future dispute down the road. Whereas I think the deed restrictions sometimes, as you say, gets lost over years. Plus, I want to make absolutely certain that the storage facility goes with this property and not as a separate commercial entity down the road.
And then the other thinking cap issue, unless, of course, it's all fair game. Of course, this is probably the easiest one. Are you cool with the fence being 6 feet along Braden?
Yes, I have no problem.
You don't want to beat that fence one up?
Okay, let's start.
That's fine. However, I'd like to bring up another point.
Go ahead.
I'm as patriotic as the next person. However, I think a 45-foot height flagpole is a little overdoing it. And I would propose that it come down to the 30-foot commercial height that we talk about as under the necessity for a separate permit. I don't see the reason why we need to have such a high flagpole.
You've got 3-story buildings throughout that site.
But even so, the 3-story building is only 35 feet high. This would be an additional 10 feet higher than that. I think the purpose of the flagpole can still be maintained, bringing it down to a normal 30-foot height. That's my recommendation.
I see it sort of as a marker for where the clubhouse is, or whatever you want to call that. What is that building?
It's a recreation.
Recreation center. So it's sort of a, go to the flag, you can see the flag and the site. And then you know where the rec center is and that sort of thing. I don't know. I just probably what they're, how tall is the one on?
No, the one on St. Helens Street,
Columbia Boulevard.
the highway in St. Helens Street.
And Greg, just so you understand, it doesn't say that there's a normal height limit of 30 feet. It just says once you get above 30 feet in a non-residential setting, that needs a land use permit.
Right, and I understand. I'm just saying, I think that we can go overboard. When we look at the sight lines, and you have a 2-story building that's only 35 feet at its apex, and now you're going to go 10 feet higher for a flagpole. And I just think that it is unnecessary, that height. That's my opinion.
It's kind of a scale issue, isn't it?
That's what I'm getting at.
Out of scale with the rest of the project.
I just want it to be a beacon from the highway, probably.
Well, you can see it throughout the rest of
But I
the project.
think that 30 or 35 feet would be beacon enough.
I think so.
I would agree to that.
35 feet,
That's enough, yes.
smaller flag.
Smaller.
What do you say, Audrey?
Nothing. I'll talk on the next issue.
Okay. Have another cup of coffee. All right. So 35 feet, Greg? Maximum 35 feet?
I would say so.
I would go with 35.
And it's a conditional use permit, so you do have some flexibility on things you can require as a result of that.
Okay.
And the basis is noted. So when we write the findings, if that survives the motion, we know how to deal with it.
Okay.
Back to the fence.
Oh, God.
I knew it. It should be a 6-foot cyclone
Oh, hey, wait a minute.
with wire at the top.
Well, that's my question. The city code, what do they say about barbed wire or concertina?
It's acceptable if it's on top of a fence greater than 6 feet in height. And it's been a while since I've had a look at that. I don't know if that applies in residential, but yeah, it is possible.
It is possible. So that's the drawback I see, but that's allowed them, you know. But residential, that was sort of if they're having trouble, they might be adding that. But it didn't say they wanted it, so.
No, and I'm assuming, because they are putting a lot of effort into making them nice.
Oh yeah, it's obvious, yeah.
And I don't know how well the razor wire would go with the elk statues.
Well,
That'd look cool.
if it was bronze, maybe.
Yeah, bronze razor wire.
The fence is going to be electric anyway.
Electrify it.
Look, no, we're gonna have Greg.
That's what I said.
Greg's be a sentinel there, right?
Now, electric fences are prohibited in the code, in our code, I believe.
It's a variance, Jacob.
Okay.
So are you ready for a motion?
Yeah.
Go for it, Greg. I'll second it.
So I propose that we approve the variance to allow the accessory structure as proposed. And that's the conditional use permit with the conditions as recommended by staff, with the addition that there be a plat required, a partition required, and that the maximum height for the flagpole be 35 feet.
And you're cool with the 6-foot fence in the front yard?
Yes, the 6-foot fence as proposed by the applicant.
I'll second it.
Okay, it's been seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Hearing none.
And then motion for signature?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Okay, well, Mark, Jeff, and Roger, I know you three are involved with this. This might be your last public hearing here, so.
That would be sad if that was it. I was wondering if I could make a clarifying question there. So with the partitioning being required, is that still a requirement that it be completed prior to building permit, or is that prior to occupancy?
Well, the condition is written under the prior to building permit issuance. The planning commission didn't seem to change that.
Okay, I was just curious. That's a long process. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Okay. Moving on here. Okay, we moving on? Okay. Public hearing is now open. This quasi-judicial land use hearing. The subject of the hearing is registered for a variance. Subject property is identified in the county assessor's map as lots 7515, 7524, 7525,
A little bit louder, Russ. Sorry.
7537, 38, 41, 43, 44 on map 4N 1W-5BC. Applicant is Lennar Northwest LLC. The owner is 1771 Columbia Boulevard LLC. Where the quasi-judicial proceedings require the observance of certain procedural formalities. We'll take a few moments to cover some preliminary matters, required statements. Does any member of the commission wish to declare ex parte contact or conflict of interest arise in this matter? Hearing none. Does any member of the, anyone from the audience object to the ability of the commissioner to make a fair decision? Is anybody on there Zoom? No? Okay, generally the order of proceedings will be as follows. Required statements, the staff report, applicant's presentation. Those in favor of the application, neutral testimony. Those opposed, rebuttal by the applicant. Final questions, close of the record, deliberations and decisions. Following statements are required to be made in the commencement of the hearing pursuant to the City Code ORS 197.7635. Following is a list of applicable substantive criteria for this decision. St. Helens Municipal Code 17.108.050 A through E. Testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed toward the applicable substantive criteria as described or other criteria in the plan, such as a comprehensive plan or land use regulations, such as that found in the development code, which the person believes applies to the decision. Failure to raise an issue, including constitutional or other issues relating to the proposed conditions of approval in this hearing in person or in writing, or failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the approving authority an opportunity to respond to the issue, precludes appeal to LUBA, the Land Use Board of Appeals. On that issue, precludes an action for damages in circuit court. Staff.
And this will be Associate Planner Dimshow.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, thanks. This hearing should sound very familiar. Many of you, I think all of you were involved, unless you were absent that hearing date from a previous variance request from Richmond American. So the new potential buyer of the remaining 33 lots in the Emerald Meadows subdivision is requesting additional variances for lot coverage. So this diagram shows the request. They're purchasing generally in this area. And this diagram also shows that Richmond received variances on the pink lots. The ones with the hash through them are variances that they did not use. So the significance of this is that they were granted variances on these lots for lot coverage, but they built them not with those variances. And I think that's significant because most variances you receive get utilized. So in this case, it's kind of an interesting thing. The ones with the asterisk correspond to either they've have the variance available to use, but a building permit has not been yet submitted, so we don't know if they're going to use those variances. I just think this is a good thing to keep up as I talk through this staff report. So as I noted, Richmond has 44 of the lots, and the remaining 33 are potentially in escrow with this new buyer, Lennar Northwest. Their request is 27% of the lots that they would own, which also happens to be the percentage that Richmond applied for and received back in March 2019. So like any variance request, we'll just go through the criteria, talk about staff's interpretation of that criteria, and then we'll get to the conditions. Fortunately, this is a lot shorter than the last hearing I covered, so hopefully it'll be a pretty quick presentation. So the first criteria is that the variance for lot coverage will not be detrimental to surrounding properties. And like any lot coverage, the St. Helens Development Code has standards to help promote streetscape and provide light, air, and space. And we do that through a number of different ways. One is lot coverage, which we're talking about tonight. 2 is maximum building height. 3 is the minimum landscaping requirement. So all of these help determine a livable streetscape. So as you go through a subdivision, you don't feel like you're crammed in or that there's lots too close together. So one way to look at whether or not this is detrimental to the subdivision is to look at the streetscape. And so they provided a image, which I will bring up here. Let's see. Can you guys see that? Does it look like a streetscape or is it still the same? Oh, I see it stopped. Let me reshare. Okay, you should see that. So one argument that you could make is that if you grant this variance, you're basically swapping building height for an increase in lot coverage. Typically, that's not an allowed code, so that's why the variance is needed. But this single story is what they're requesting the variance for, and so this is what you would see on the street. You'd see a varied mix of two-story homes with single-story homes. So that's what that's discussing. So, and just to apply some numbers here, the maximum building height in this zoning district is 35 feet. The 2 models that they're hoping to be able to utilize with this variance range between 17 and 18 feet. And typically 2-story homes are 24 to 28 feet. So these are about, under 30 feet. These are under 20 feet. The first criteria also talks about conflicts with comp plan policies. I just wanted to note that there is a comp plan policy that's in our general housing goals and policies that encourages and cooperates with all efforts to provide housing for those with special needs. And the applicant talks about in their narrative the need for single-story housing supports, you know, families with children or people with mobility devices and elderly population. So I thought that was an important note and is also an argument that Richmond uses. Let's see. So Criterion C, this requires that standards are maintained to the greatest extent possible. And one thought about that is, you know, we can just acknowledge that this is for only 27% of the lots. So that could be enough to say, well, this is the greatest extent possible. Another point to make here is that, you know, variances run with the land. And so like the Richmond variances, to prevent a future buyer from buying the lots after variances are granted, we want a condition in there that limits the variances only to be used with these specific models of homes. We're kind of basing our conditions and our findings around these models. And so the actual table for the lot coverage variances would be included in the findings. And those are the only homes they could build on these lots should these variances be granted. So that also helps with this condition about greatest extent possible. One other thing to note, lot coverage standards can be increased by 5% without a new variance. That's already something in the code. And this is for new accessory structures. So if someone wanted to come and build a shed and they were close to their lot coverage maximum already, we can increase their lot coverage standard by 5% without going through a public hearing. It also applies for auxiliary dwelling units. So if they want to build a second dwelling and go through that process, they can increase their lot coverage standard without a variance that way. And it also applies to enlargements or remodels of existing buildings, accessory structures, or auxiliary dwelling units. So if you wanted to remodel your kitchen, add square footage, you could come to Jacob or I and receive that building permit application and go up to potentially 40% without a variance. So therefore, it's reasonable that a 5% lot coverage variance is still maintaining the extent as reasonable or as great as possible. So that's in there. And the commission could decide to cap it at 40%. So if you want to make that argument that a 5% is reasonable, you could cap the request at 40%. That would allow 7 of 9 of their variance requests to go through. So D talks about the existing physical and natural systems not being adversely affected as the result of this variance. I just noted that all other setback requirements, so front, rear, side yards, will all still be met if this variance is granted. And then also compliance with utility and access easements is still necessary. So they can't encroach on any existing easements, and setbacks still have to be met. For E, the minimum, this requires that the variance is not self-imposed and that the variance is the minimum necessary to alleviate the hardship. I just wanted to note that this standard for lot coverage has been in our code for a long time, and certainly well within this applicant entering into escrow with the current owner. So that it's a little bit difficult to say it's not self-imposed. Regarding the minimum necessary, we kind of talked about the two options there. You could grant the variances in full and just say that it only applies to these models, or you could cap the variance request at a certain amount and just say you can only go up to, 38%, 40%. And then I'll show the table of their requests. I think that's a helpful diagram. So in the conditions, we've just put the table in. So there's only 4 conditions here to go through. First is just corresponding to this table here. You could choose to limit the variance request at a certain amount, and that would rule out some of the requests. I did want to note too, looking at this 7.5% seemed like an outlier. The average variance request is 4.3. So it's worth noting that the average is under 5. I think I'm just going to open it up for questions. Really, that's the only condition to discuss. If we want to limit it based on that minimum necessary to alleviate the hardship criteria, or if there are other questions we can address, I think now's the time.
Jenny, could you go back to the overview for the entire subdivision?
Yes.
Thank you. And while you're doing that, do you have by chance the percentage of 3-bedroom homes in the city's housing mix? Do you have that information available?
Overall, like
Yes.
all of the city's housing? No, we don't keep track of that.
Okay.
That granular detail. Yeah.
I didn't know.
Can you see the screen here? Do you see the diagram, or is it still the same? I can't.
No, I see the list of lots and the,
Okay, let me reshare. I think I have to redo it every time for some reason. So now it should show the diagram of the full
There you go.
subdivision. Okay.
this, yeah, that's what I wanted. Thank you.
Yeah.
So now if we were to go with the 7 of the 9, which are the 2 lots that would be returned to regular sizes?
So lot 37 is that jumbo request, the 7.5% variance request.
Okay.
And lot 37's here.
And what is the other one?
The other one is actually only 0.1 over the request. So that's a pretty strict compliance with 5%. You know, typically if we round down, if the percentage is only a 0.1 request over, but it's lot 71,
Okay.
which is one of the more narrow ones here.
Okay.
And I did want to point out, maybe I kind of rushed through this, but all of these models are single-story homes. And if you read through the narrative, you would know that, but just to
Right.
clarify, they're asking for variance requests on single-level homes. And the argument being it's hard to have a larger home on a single floor and meet their square footage needs.
Right.
And Lennar works like Richmond in that they have kind of base models. And so their argument is that they don't have a base model that accommodates a less lot coverage standard for single
Right.
levels.
Are these supposed to be affordable?
There are some arguments in the applicant's narrative about how single level homes are more affordable. Staff's not going to make that claim about affordability because we can't.
Well, that's what these lots were. The city council approved them to be R5. And that was the argument, the houses would be affordable.
Right. So you're referring to the zone change from R7 to R5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the cheapest one yesterday was a 2-bedroom, 2-bath at $321, I believe. That's not affordable housing.
Yeah, and maybe the applicant can address that. They are a different home builder. They're not Richmond. So that's a good question for them, I think, to answer in their testimony.
Yeah.
Anyone in the chamber?
Okay. Could we hear from the applicant?
Good evening. David, turn that off, please. I'm getting feedback. All right, sorry about that. I was getting some feedback from the other computer that was on. I'm Michael Anders with Lennar, and with me this evening I have David Force and Shelley Nelson. We will try to make this as brief as possible because I know you already heard this previously with Richmond, and it's been a long evening for you. Just a brief summary of how we came to request a variance. when we decide to build a community and enter into a market, we do an extensive amount of research. And part of that research that we do is we took a look at your housing needs analysis. We looked at, we researched all the existing housing stock, all the current builders that are building in your community presently and what they're offering, as well as what are the upcoming subdivision plats that are being proposed for your community. And we look at all the demographic work. And through that process, we come up with what we believe is a viable plan and a need for certain types of housing that are in your market. And our goal is to provide several types of housing options to meet numerous buyer profiles. So part of that process in doing that evaluation is we feel that there's a need for ranch homes that fit a certain size, function, and price point within your market. The variance that we're requesting would allow us to obtain a certain size of home for a ranch home and meet certain price points that we believe that are viable for the market. A few of the factors that we'd like the Planning Commission to consider is that how we do our business is a little bit different than our competitors. We pre-plot the entire community prior to starting building. So we know which homes are going on which home site, and we don't, especially on a community of this size, which is a little smaller than we normally do, we don't deviate from that. So if we're saying that we're going to put a certain home on a certain home site, that's what we're going to build. We're a speculative builder, and the fact that we are not waiting for a homeowner to come to us to pick a plan or to pick all their selections and what have you. We're going to build 2 to 3 homes a month, and we're going to start 2 to 3 homes a month, and we're going to hopefully find buyers that find the homes appealing and want to move into them. And that's why we do all of our research up front to the extent that we do. The other thing that I'd like you to consider is we as a division execute on what we call our EI platform. EI stands for everything's included, and everything's included means a little bit something different in each community and in each city that we work in. But for you to know, EI in this community that we would be building in would include front and rear landscaping. It would include the fencing. It would include blinds. And the goal is really that when that homeowner moves in, that the home is pretty much comes with, it's pretty complete. You know, the only upgrades that we really foresee are air conditioning and probably washer, dryer, refrigerator. So the other thing that does, as we build through the community, it provides a neat and tidy look upon completion. I know there was some communication or some discussion there regarding price point. Price point really is, affordable is kind of a relative factor. In looking at this community, we took price point into consideration. We looked at your housing needs analysis, and there's a median price that is within your housing needs analysis, and we're trying hard to try to stay within a certain price point. And our average target price point is within the median price range that is shown in your housing needs analysis, and we shouldn't vary dramatically from that because, again, with our EI platform, we're setting a price and building a home to a certain price point and not waiting for the buyer to come along and add a whole bunch of upgrades or change the floor plan and go to a larger home. We also understand that every city is different and everybody does their business differently. But we feel that our request isn't completely out of line, and we work probably between 2 different states. We probably work in about 15 at least different municipalities. And many of the lot coverage ratios vary from 45% to 50%. So we feel that we're trying to stay within what we're used to working in every city. And again, I understand not every city is the same, and trying to respect your codes as well. One of the things to point out in reading through your housing needs analysis is that it recommends that the city consider some code changes and monitor the housing market to achieve its housing goals. Your housing policy number 1 is to maintain adequate development of building codes to achieve the city's housing goals. And as the staff and council is well aware that the variance is a vehicle to allow some flexibility in the code, and without taking away the objective of the code. So really what we're asking for is to introduce some ranch homes of a certain size, and to meet what we believe is important for the market. And ranch homes are becoming increasingly harder to find in market due to shrinking lot sizes, as well as just topography and some of the challenges of getting ranch homes on shrinking home sites. So we believe that the request for the variance is within the city's housing goals and policies, and we're respectfully requesting your approval.
It doesn't answer point. It's
What'd you say, Audrey?
he's not giving us what the medium cost is.
So one thing is, until we go to market, we don't set pricing. I will tell you that the range of pricing it's the median price that's targeted for the community is within the same price range. And I'm sorry, I don't have the housing needs analysis up in front of me, but when we researched it, that's the target range for the median price in your analysis that we were shooting for.
You know what it is, Jacob?
I'm sorry?
I will proceed. Do we have any testimony in support of the application? None seen here on the floor. We do have a letter from Wayne Wygant. You may know him. In support of the variance.
And Russ, I want to point out too, we also received an email from Al Peterson, which I forwarded to Lennar as well, in opposition to this variance request. It was emailed to the commission after reports were already created. So you didn't have hard copies in your file, but
Did the applicant get to see that too?
yes. And if they want to rebut that during rebuttal, they can.
That's fine, as long as they got to see it.
Yeah.
In favor, and on to neutral. Jumping around here. Neutral.
So Jennifer Pugsley, I'm assuming for the record, you'd like to hear my name. I'd like to say that as a real estate broker in St. Helens for the last 26 years, I cannot remember a time when we did not need ranch style homes, especially in new construction. So generally when I'm taking clients around, single level homes sell much easier than 2-story homes. So I would say Lennar built a beautiful product in Scappoose, and I would expect them to do the same here. And we need more single level homes. And one thing to think about as far as affordability is interest rates are at a historic low. You get somewhere close to 3%. And so take that into account when you're looking at their price ranges, because it can change. So.
Okay. Great. Nobody else on Zoom? Okay. All right. And rebuttal by the applicant, I guess there's nothing to rebut. Have you read Al Peterson's?
Yes, we did. And just like to have a few comments maybe regarding the rebuttal.
Yes.
So just for clarification, we're not the developer, but we're a home builder that's desiring to purchase the remaining home sites that are in the community. Our research of the home sites themselves, the code, the market, was what led us to the variance request. So we're not asking for a wholesale variance as the letter states, but we're asking for a specific variance to 9 home sites on 9 specific lots, which is 27% of the acquisition. So our request is, it's not also due to the inability to build different home types, but it's a request to build a variety of homes with a different function, livability, and price points to serve the broader St. Helens market. So our request is not what we feel is one of being lazy. It's one that we feel we're taking the extra steps and cost and time to actually submit a variance. And we believe that taking these extra steps and to strive for a certain product size and price point that the market will want to purchase, that it will be more desirable for the community. So
to respond to that, I think that the letter was more pointing out that this was not a self-imposed, or this wasn't a hardship that was created before. This was actually something you knew about at the time that you proposed to purchase these sites. You knew what the city's rules were as far as the size of the lots and so forth. So it's not as if this were a hardship that was placed on you by the city's rules. This was a self-inflicted hardship because your decision about the type of home that you want to build. I think that's what the letter writer was getting at.
So to clarify that is we haven't purchased the home sites yet.
No,
So
I said proposed.
Yeah, so part of our due diligence is to dive into the code and all the nuances, plot the homes, et cetera, to understand what we are purchasing. And then during our due diligence, when we discovered that we wouldn't be able to achieve building ranch homes that we believe are marketable, that we chose to seek the variance.
All right.
Questions? Any other final questions? All right, the hearing, no further questions from the commission and no further responses from the staff. The public hearing is closed and this matter is returned to the table for deliberations and oral decisions.
I have one question for staff, please.
Okay.
Is there anything that would limit the developer or the owner of the lots, the remaining lots, to come later before the planning commission and request additional variances for additional lots?
Are you asking if there's a way we can restrict that?
Well, my question was actually, can the property owner, developer down the road request variances for any of the remaining lots?
So they're proposing to buy all of the remaining lots. There will be no more lots in Emerald Meadows if this property owner purchases the property.
Okay, so say that transpires, and this developer then owns all the remaining lots.
Yes.
Down the road, in 6 months or a year's time, can the company come back and request additional variances on additional lots?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, but the findings we're having today, or could have today, I mean, we're basing them on it being 27% of the lots. So I can't see how we would grant future lot coverage variances. But I don't know if Jacob wants to chime in here. I don't really have a good response to that.
Okay.
If someone wants to apply for a variance, they have every right to do so. And then it's up to the planning commission to, you know, look at the standards and determine if it's justified. So.
Yeah, I guess my point is if more lot coverage variances came in, I don't see how you could justify approving additional ones given this staff report.
So does the staff have any kind of, are they leaning one way or the other regarding either a full approval, granting variance for the full proposal, or setting a cap?
Well, I don't think it affects the end result very much, setting a cap.
Okay.
You know, if we go on precedence, they're requesting the same percentage of lots that they would own. I don't feel one way or another.
Okay.
Amended back when the subdivision was coming in, we recommended an R7, and this would not be an issue. So that's a little angst we have, I think, with the second time around with reduced lots.
Well, and the city granted the R5 for affordable housing, and that's not what's been offered by those that got a variance.
Yeah, what's affordable these days, so.
That's very true. It's left up to, the definition is left up to the sellers.
But to Greg's is like, well, when do we do this again? You know, are we gonna come back here again and lots? Or they looked at these lots and these are particular ones they just need to do this in. So keep sending this to city council.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, if you're deliberating.
Can't hear you.
Do we have any comment? No comment, okay.
Do you want us to vote by participant
By what?
on this?
How should we pull this together?
Well, you know, you're trying to see where everybody's at and ultimately come up with a motion. And so, you know, the first question is, you know, where is the commission feeling about approval or not? Now, and then at that discussion, it looks like you're having approval, then you look at some of the conditions that Associate Planner Dimshow talked about. If you're leaning towards denial, we just need to understand the basis. The other option, which is rarely exercised, I think it's 2/3 vote, you can just kick it up to the council.
that was sort of my thought. Okay.
I'd want to confirm that, and I can do that now, but that is an option that you have.
Do you want to vote on what we want to do?
I think they're currently looking up whether or not you can vote to kick the decision to city council. And I would wait for that because that may be a better alternative if the planning commission is leaning towards denial.
Let's see if we can do, well, Audrey and Greg, you're on Zoom. How are you guys leaning?
Well, in one
Just registered mine as no.
in one respect, the applicant knew what the rules were at the time they offered to purchase the property. On the other hand, it's very true that one-story, three-bedroom homes in this community are somewhat few and far between. Most of them are two stories. So I think you have to weigh those two things. Originally, I was leaning against it, but I think that the fact that the previous owner only has used a portion of the approved variance that was previously granted by the Planning Commission tends to show a good faith effort on their part not to overplay their cards. So I guess the bottom line is, I guess I would probably end up supporting the applicant. And if we could put in a stipulation that no additional variances could be, proposed for this subdivision, I would like to do that, but I don't think that's legal.
Right.
That the assumption is that it exhausts the variances, and that wouldn't help future clustered variance proposals.
Yeah. Well, and that also would limit the future of planning commissions too to make that decision. But
So we heard from Audrey and Greg. I think it would be good to hear from the other commissioners in the council chambers.
that's fine.
How do you feel about it?
My opinion is buyer beware. I go for no.
I'm on the fence. We have an approved project. They want to increase the size of homes beyond that since they bought the property. It is the bigger ones that you wanted to make even larger, is that correct? We can't ask him, huh?
Yeah. So I think what you've got.
There's two homes. That's three different.
I guess the problem, are we gonna have to come do this again when they have, the market is saying, oh, we only need homes that they want to build?
This allows them to utilize the maximum lot coverage increase, but they don't have to. So if the market demanded two-story homes and they didn't want to utilize the lot coverage increase, they wouldn't have to.
Right, but it's my understanding they have all the rest of those lots.
Yeah, you know, I think they looked at how many they need and requested that many.
Well, you can always
How
throw
many
a motion
houses
out
were
there.
already built?
That's a good question. Did you say how many houses have already been built?
Right.
Yeah, it's less than 50%.
And the market's telling them now that they need the one-story home, so.
I know there's still 3 for sale in the first group.
Well, you can always make a motion, see what happens.
Can we defer this to city council?
Yeah, so planning commission may refer any matter directly to the city council with or without cause, with a 2/3 affirmative vote from appointed members. And so we have 6 members.
5. You have 5.
7 is the normal number. We have 1 resignation. That brings us to 6.
But that resignation was not valid at today's meeting, right?
But how do we get a vote?
Well, regardless, 2/3,
2/3.
we would want to make sure that we have 4 votes. If you consider 7, 5, I mean, for the sake of not being wishy-washy, if all the current commissioners voted to kick it up to the next level, then it would be clear without dispute. So it'd be an affirmative vote.
That's fine. Well, before
Are
we
you
do,
talking,
oh, go ahead.
what is the next level?
City council.
So it would be, you would refer this matter to the city council instead of making a decision on it yourselves.
For that, you'd want a yes vote.
You would have to have a motion, and we would need to have affirmative votes from 2/3. And what I'm saying is for the sake of clarity, so it's undisputable, ideally every present member would vote if that was a motion.
Okay. Before we go to the extreme, though, let me throw out motion to proposed motion to grant the variance as requested.
Are there any seconds?
No seconds.
Okay. Then I think that you only have 2 options then.
Would you like to make a motion to refer this decision to the city council?
Well, the city council's gonna approve it, but at least they'll take the vote.
Yeah, well, at least they can share in our angst about this whole ongoing saga.
Would you repeat that, Russ?
They can share in our angst about this whole development.
No, they'll claim it.
Well, we can always, there is another option. The other option is to deny the request. And it can still be appealed proponent to the city council.
That's a good point.
I'm for denying and letting, referring
You'd rather see it denied than send it on to city council?
No, it would go there.
They could request
Well,
from city council.
a denial would be the same as our R7, and they turned down what we proposed. So if we deny it and they approve it, it's the same as going to R5. And like what we did, so they overturned.
Would you like to make a motion like that?
We deny it.
I'll second.
Okay. All in favor of denied?
Aye.
Okay.
It's unanimous.
Opposed? It's unanimous. That's right. We all have four.
So the next step for them is to appeal to city council if they want to.
Yeah, they can appeal to the council. And then, do you want to review this decision or authorize signature?
Authorized signature.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Jacob, did you have clarity on the basis of denial? I heard self-imposed as the main reason.
Sounds good to me.
We'll talk about it.
Okay.
Okay, well, thanks for showing up.
So number 5.
Number 5, annual report to council.
So every year we get to do the annual report to the council. And it's always weird for the planning commission because you're so different. I have the memo, and I can pull it up on the screen if you want to see it. But every year, well, since I've been here, we whip up this memo that just shows the number of meetings we had, public hearings, you know, all these items as kind of the metric of stuff that we've done. And even though the council asks for a member to present, except for 1 year, I've done it. And, you know, staff can keep doing it because the planning commission is kind of unique. But it's a matter of looking at this report and going, yeah, those numbers look interesting. And then as far as future projects, we know we have some housing code amendments on the horizon. Usually you don't have to look for work, it comes to you. So that's what makes it kind of unique. But there's always the question was, what can the council do to support the commission? Which is always a fun question, especially when we talk about projects like Emerald Meadows. And if you don't have anything to say about it, that's fine. But it's an opportunity that the council provides for you to be able to talk about that. And that's the annual report. So one, do you have any ideas about that? And if not, that's fine. And does anybody want to give the report to the council? And if no volunteers, staff will do it.
I nominate you.
Thankfully, you can't nominate me for chairman or chairperson.
I nominated you to take the report to council.
Okay, that's fine.
Can I throw out a suggestion or something to consider? Rather than a report, is there a possibility that we might share some time as a group with the city council to sort of brainstorm where both sides see planning going?
And I think as far as the question, that would be something that, so we give the basic report and we say, well, the planning commission, assuming that the rest of the members concur with your thoughts, would like to have a joint work session just for overall goals with the council.
It might be on
We talked about doing this before.
I mean, I think that it's time, it's been a long time since this planning commission has really sat down with the city council as a group to sort of talk about long-range ideas and stuff. And I think that the last meeting, we learned a lot, at least I did, as far as where the council was coming from. And I hope that they took something back from our discussion with them. So I think it's a good opportunity.
How about the rest of you? You feel?
I agree with Greg.
Yeah, I think we could come up. Yeah, I think.
Because we had that one meeting in a round table.
Exactly, yes.
That was what, 4 or 5 years ago?
Oh, it's been quite a while.
Yeah, a long time, but it was productive.
Come up with a outline. Maybe everybody could jot down something that concerns them.
Oh, yeah.
We could get an outline, so we could, get right to the point with them, not just have to sit around talking about whatever. I can see one after tonight. It's frustrating to see the Columbia Boulevard development go where I don't think it's a bad design, but it's all legal, and it's, that's what he does. He makes little houses and the cookie cutters, and Jennifer Pugsley mentioned it, redesigned it, but he's got a cookie cutter and he doesn't know how to change anything around. So if that could be one of our topics to talk about design review in some sense.
I think it's a good precursor to us examining our housing codes. And so if you all got into that discussion, that's going to help inform us and, where's the unified message. So yeah, I think that's a great idea.
I think we're sitting, hopefully it would be beyond Zoom. It'd be nice, just face to face is nicer, but if we're sitting down with them rather than telling you we want something.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think one of the other points that I would like to have both sides discuss a little bit more is on the riverfront Old Town development, because that's going to be a major project, and I think that we both have to have some clarity about where the city council sees the project going, and sort of get, some general feedback from the planning commission members too. So I think that this is a good time. It behooves us to be able to sit down and discuss that in a workshop setting before, any decisions have to be made down the road.
Yeah, I think they, like waterfront and other things, they keep so close to themselves that nobody really knows. I'm sure some people know what's going on, but the general public is,
That's right.
Oh, never mind.
Help us make our
And
decisions.
then we can make decisions from that. But I guess what we're trying to say is allow us to come in and help you make a decision. We're a big body of people that is, we're all individual thinkers, and it'd be nice to help them rather than, get this subdivision stuff thrown at us. It's just more creative, more planning, really. We don't do any planning.
Let's see where they're coming from. What
I
they
agree.
Your cat's needing a blanket or something behind you, Jenny.
I know. She wants her phone off.
She's wearing a lampshade.
So do you want to do that?
Yes, let's do that.
Yeah, so I'll mention that to them. Of course, Council Carlson is listening, and then, we'll see if the council does when they want to do it and all that fun stuff.
Great. Hopefully they'll do it after when we can meet as not on Zoom.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll mention ideally it's in the in-person days.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Does anybody have a crystal ball that tells when that's going to happen?
Sure do.
Okay, sorry. Pay attention. Okay, Planning Commission Interview Committee recommendation.
All right, so the Planning Commission Interview Committee met and interviewed several people, and they felt that none of the applicants were qualified. So I'm just kidding.
We're giving Jennifer a front row seat.
Yeah, so Jennifer's here tonight, so we have to pick on her a little bit. We had it was a good, we usually don't get a lot of applicants, but the interview committee felt that Jennifer was the best candidate. Council Carlson, you know, her analogy in looking at the planning commission like a basketball team and every person having their different skill sets. And the one thing that we haven't had on this committee for a while is someone, well, a realtor. We haven't had a realtor since Steve Sickles was on this committee when I first started. So it's been over a decade since we've had someone in the realtor, which is really weird because I'm used to planning commissioners. You're trying to, no, we already have 2 realtors. We can't have any more by law. So that was kind of, so that anyways, it fills that, and that's a natural profession for the position. And then also her knowledge of historic preservation techniques, which is something that when Al Peterson left, you know, he had a lot of knowledge there. So in the basketball team analogy, it seemed a good fit. And obviously she's interested. She sat through the several hours we had tonight as not running away screaming. So that's
It's hard to stay quiet.
pretty good indication. So the formality then is our city recorder wants to make sure that the group at large is okay with the recommendation. And then Council Carlson will bring that to the next council meeting on Wednesday. And that way Jennifer can join us for the June Planning Commission meeting.
Good.
So, and I'm assuming we probably should have a motion just to be formal. So you're cool with, yeah.
Who seconds it?
We need a second.
Oh, okay.
Those in favor?
All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous.
I didn't hear you, Audrey.
Well, I wanted to know what the motion was.
To accept her.
To accept Jennifer as our new
Well, I'm thinking it over. I'll mail my vote in.
Don't wait too long.
You're an interview committee person.
I know it.
Yeah.
I'm for it.
She's almost the only one that showed up. We gotta take her.
Yeah.
Okay, acceptance agenda.
So
All right,
move
enough of all of you. Thank you.
motion to approve.
You get to experience this again and again.
Yes, I
It's
was
not
a
all-
planning commissioner in Columbia City for a few years,
Yeah.
20 years ago. So,
It's not always this late.
thank you.
Thank you for coming, Jennifer.
Okay, acceptance agenda.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
It's unanimous. Okay, planning director decisions.
Yep.
Okay,
Okay.
Motion to accept them.
Okay. Again, okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, unanimous.
We didn't need a motion on that.
That's what I thought, but I was
Not really,
forced into it.
We made it look
Okay, planning department activity reports. Anything on that? A lot of grants, Jennifer's been busy with grants.
Yeah, it's been a lot of grants, a lot of development activity. April was a nightmare. April was really tough. Too much going on, but we got through it.
Even closing your doors, not letting the public in, it was still busy.
Yeah, in fact, and it was a blessing. Well, I mean, the COVID stuff resulted in some stuff taking more time, like, you know, this whole thing is different. But if we were open to the public, I don't know, it would just been more 8 hours. It was just a lot of stuff hit us at once.
Right.
But you know, over the last 3 years, we've had a lot of big projects, and you know, a lot of those projects are starting to come to a close. And so I think we're seeing the tail end of that wave. So there'll be a little more time to breathe.
So we don't need any more apartments.
Well, that pops something to mind. We had a developer proposing to build senior center business right across the street from Walmart. Is that?
That's still
Still floating a little?
yes, yep. It is.
Now, did that funding have any change in the variances? That's just the ownership is changing and.
Yeah, they could sell it to someone else who, they could sell it to LeGrand Townhomes.
Right.
And if because the approval goes with the land, that site plan goes with the land. But yeah, they did partner with some state agency for funding, and I know they're working behind the scenes because Lower Columbia Engineering has contacted us because they're the engineer of record. They haven't submitted any building permits yet, but their wheels are still in motion.
That's why he's not returning my phone calls. Ginny, the council, is there any, what's on the police station?
I'm not sure.
Oh, I know that actually. For the police station, the next thing we're gonna do is get some topographic data. We want to be extra sure where the floodplain is, to make sure that we're not surprised by, oh, wow, there's a lot more on there than we thought. Because it's a critical facility in the floodplain, there's the elevation. You know, we want to be sure that the choice, that we're not going to have egg on our face. So we're going to get the surveyor to run some topo to understand those levels more accurately.
Sure would be embarrassing if the police station flooded.
Well, not only that, but just think the additional costs for all the engineering and all that stuff. It's gonna be very expensive.
Can you imagine how embarrassing
You
it
know
is?
where my heart lies on that.
So it's just part of the feasibility of it.
Okay, anything else from anybody? Okay,
Motion to adjourn.
motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay.
All right, thanks everybody in Zoom land.
Stay
Oh,
safe.
you're welcome.
Unplugging you.
Stay safe.
Enjoy,
Yeah.
enjoy all the snacks.
Good night.